Imagine for a moment that you are standing in complete darkness. Not the darkness of a room with a closed door, but the darkness that exists beneath centuries of stone and earth. Above you, somewhere far beyond reach, sunlight touches the towers of a medieval castle. But here, where you stand now, there is only the sound of water dripping against ancient walls, each drop a small echo that reminds you that time moves differently in places like this. And there is wind, too, a low and constant hum that seems to come from nowhere and everywhere at once, as if the stone itself is breathing. This is the dungeon. Not the place you have read about in books or seen in films, but the real one. The one that existed beneath nearly every fortress, cathedral, and walled city built during the medieval period. It is a world that most people will never see, and fewer still will truly understand. Yet for nearly 1,000 years, these chambers existed as a parallel reality to the grand halls and courtrooms above. While kings made decisions in sunlit rooms, another form of authority was being exercised in the darkness below. The architecture of these places tells a story that few people notice. Dungeons were rarely designed to be functional prisons in the way we might think of them today. They were not built primarily to hold criminals or to separate the dangerous from the innocent. Instead, they were designed to send a message. The message was simple, but profound. Power reaches everywhere. Power reaches down into the earth. Power reaches into stone. Power reaches into places from which there is no escape. This message was not meant only for those who ended up in the dungeon. It was meant for everyone who lived above it, everyone who walked past the entrance, everyone who knew the dungeon existed beneath their feet. The typical medieval dungeon was a place of architectural contradiction. Some chambers were barely larger than closets, while others could hold dozens of people. Some had windows cut high into the walls, allowing narrow shafts of light to penetrate the gloom. Others were sealed completely, cut off from any natural light or air. The walls themselves were remarkably thick, sometimes 10 feet or more, not because the builders were concerned that prisoners might dig their way out, but because such thickness served a symbolic purpose. These walls were meant to feel permanent, immovable, eternal. They were meant to be felt as much as seen. Water was always present in medieval dungeons, and it served multiple purposes. In many cases, the dungeon was intentionally positioned at the lowest point of the castle, where groundwater naturally accumulated. This was partly practical. Water prevented escape attempts through underground tunnels, but it was also psychological. The constant presence of moisture, the sound of dripping water, the slow growth of mold and algae on the stone walls, all of these created an environment that felt alive with decay. A prisoner in such a place would not simply feel imprisoned by locks and walls. They would feel imprisoned by the very earth itself. What is remarkable about medieval dungeons is that most of them held very few prisoners. Historical records show that the dungeons of even the largest castles rarely contained more than a handful of people at any given time. This raises an important question. If dungeons were not primarily functional spaces for holding large numbers of prisoners, what were they really for? The answer reveals something fundamental about medieval power structures. Dungeons existed because authority required that they exist. They were monuments to control, built to be known rather than used. A dungeon that was always full would have been seen as a failure of authority. A dungeon that was feared, but rarely used, that was a success. The fear of the dungeon extended far beyond the walls themselves. In many medieval cities and towns, rumors about dungeons would circulate for generations. Stories would grow and transform. People would speak in whispers about things that may or may not have happened in those dark chambers. The dungeon became a psychological space as much as a physical one. It lived in the imagination of the people who lived above it. And that, perhaps, was its greatest function of all. As we descend deeper into these layers of history, we begin to encounter the actual stories of the people who found themselves trapped within these spaces, the prisoners whose names were often forgotten, whose crimes may or may not have been recorded, and whose experiences remain hidden in the silence of the stone. Descend with us now, deeper still. The light from the entrance fades completely. Your only illumination comes from a single torch, held by an imaginary guide, its flame casting dancing shadows across walls that haven't seen daylight in centuries. The temperature drops. Your breath becomes visible in the dimness. And then you notice something that cannot be ignored. The air itself feels different. It is heavier somehow, weighted down by something you cannot see or name. This is the air of the dungeon, the air that prisoners breathed for days, weeks, sometimes years. It is an air thick with moisture, with the smell of stone saturated by groundwater, with the faint metallic taste of minerals that have been leaching from the walls since the day they were built. But there is something else in this air too, something that no amount of time has managed to wash away. It is the presence of human despair, lingering like an invisible fog. Medieval dungeon designers understood something that modern architects often overlook. The physical space itself can be a form of torture. It was not necessary to chain a prisoner or strike them to cause suffering. The environment would do the work for you. The ceilings were designed to be low, often no more than 6 or 7 feet high, sometimes lower. A man of average height could stand, but only barely. He could not stretch his arms above his head without his fingers brushing damp stone. In many dungeons, the ceilings were even lower in certain chambers, forcing prisoners to crouch or lie down most of the time. This constant compression of the body had a cascading effect on the mind. There was no moment of relief, no moment when a prisoner could fully straighten their spine and take a deep breath. Even the simple act of breathing became a physical reminder of confinement. The isolation that existed in medieval dungeons was unlike anything most modern people have experienced. A prisoner in the depths of a castle might be entirely alone, sealed away in a chamber so far beneath the surface that sound could barely penetrate. They would hear nothing from the world above. No voices. No footsteps in corridors. No indication that life was continuing in the sunlit rooms far overhead. The silence was so complete that it became its own form of sound, a pressure inside the ears that grew more intense the longer it lasted. For some prisoners, this silence was broken only when a guard appeared to deliver bread and water. For others, days or weeks might pass with no human contact whatsoever. The human mind is not designed to exist in such absolute isolation. After a certain point, the silence stops being peaceful and becomes threatening. It begins to feel like the walls are listening, like the darkness itself has become a presence. Yet contradictorily, medieval dungeons were often not silent at all. Many dungeons held multiple prisoners, confined to separate cells but close enough that they could hear each other. In this configuration, the isolation became even more cruel. A prisoner could hear the moans and movements of other human beings through the walls, could hear distant coughing or weeping, but could never see who was making the sounds. They could never communicate. They could only listen to evidence of other suffering and know that they too were being heard, that their own sounds of distress were reaching unknown ears in adjacent chambers. This created a peculiar psychological torture, the knowledge that you were not alone, but utterly unable to connect with anyone. The darkness of a medieval dungeon was not the simple darkness of a room without light. It was a darkness so complete that after a short time, most people begin to see things that are not there. The eyes, desperate for any stimulus, manufacture images. Shadows become shapes. Shapes become faces. For a prisoner confined to a dungeon cell with minimal or no light, these hallucinations could become as real as the walls themselves. They could become companions, tormentors, or harbingers of madness. Medieval people understood this instinctively. Darkness was not merely the absence of light, it was an active agent of psychological transformation. This is why torches were sometimes kept burning in dungeon corridors, not to help prisoners see, but to make them aware that light existed somewhere nearby, just beyond their reach. The tantalizing presence of distant light created a constant awareness of what the prisoner was missing. The moisture that accumulated in dungeon spaces served multiple psychological purposes beyond the practical considerations of preventing escape. Damp, cold stone has a particular effect on the human body and mind. It creates a constant, low-level discomfort that never quite becomes unbearable enough to demand urgent action, but never fades either. A prisoner's clothing would never fully dry. Their skin would remain clammy. Their bones would ache with a deep, penetrating cold that seemed to come not from the air, but from the stone itself. Over weeks or months, this condition broke down resistance in ways that active torture never could. A person subjected to intense pain might find moments of relief, moments when the mind could focus on hope or escape. But a person in constant, low-level discomfort, never given the possibility of becoming warm or dry, slowly surrenders. The body becomes the enemy. Comfort becomes a theoretical concept rather than an achievable state. The architects of medieval dungeons rarely recorded their intentions, but the consistent design choices across different castles and fortresses suggest a unified understanding of how to break the human spirit through environmental design. The low ceilings, the isolation, the moisture, the darkness, the silence punctuated by distant suffering, all of these were deliberate choices. They were not the unfortunate byproducts of limited medieval technology. They were features, not bugs. And they worked precisely as intended. A prisoner confined to such a space for a sufficient length of time would eventually lose their sense of self. They would lose track of time. They would lose the ability to distinguish between memories and hallucinations, between past and present. They would, in effect, become someone else, someone broken, someone defeated, someone who no longer possessed the psychological resources to resist. This is what made the medieval dungeons so effective as an instrument of power. It was not designed to kill you. It was designed to reduce you to a state where you would wish that death would come. It was designed to hollow you out from within. And when you were finally released, if you were ever released, you would carry that hollowness with you for the rest of your life. Everyone around you would see it. They would see a person who had been touched by something beyond ordinary punishment. They would see what fear had done. And in seeing that transformation, they would understand, without needing to be told, what power truly meant. Yet to understand the full weight of this horror, we must move beyond the architecture and the psychology. We must meet the actual people who lived through it, the prisoners whose names were recorded, whose stories survived the centuries, whose fates reveal truths about justice and mercy that medieval societies would have preferred to forget. The dungeon was never full of a single type of person. Walk through the corridors of history, and you will find that the cells held a strange and varied collection of prisoners, each one a story of how power could reach down and claim a person, for reasons that had very little to do with justice. Understanding who inhabited these spaces requires us to forget many of the assumptions we carry about medieval law and order. Justice, in the way we use the word today, rarely enters into the picture. What we find instead is politics, convenience, and the settling of scores between people who had far more power than anyone else. Consider the case of nobles who fell from grace. Medieval aristocracy was a precarious thing, built on shifting alliances and constantly negotiating favour with those above them. A nobleman who found himself on the wrong side of a more powerful lord's mood could find himself stripped of his lands and thrown into a dungeon with almost no formal process. There was no trial in the modern sense. There were no witnesses called to verify claims. There was simply a decision made in a sunlit room, followed by a summons, followed by dissent. Some of these men had genuinely committed crimes. They had rebelled, or plotted, or failed in their duties. But many others had committed nothing more serious than having the wrong family connection or being in the wrong place when a political alliance shifted. The dungeon became a tool for removing inconvenient nobles from the game entirely. An imprisoned nobleman could not raise an army, could not marry strategically, could not form new alliances. He could simply exist, forgotten, in the darkness below. The fate of fallen nobles often depended on their perceived value. A nobleman from an important family might be held for ransom, or as a hostage to guarantee the behavior of his relatives. In such cases, the nobleman might be treated with a certain minimal dignity, better food, a larger cell, perhaps the privilege of receiving visitors. But a nobleman whose family was no longer powerful, or who had no allies left who might pay for his release, had no such guarantee. He would descend into the same conditions as any other prisoner, with his former status meaning nothing in the darkness. The contrast between what he had been and what he had become often proved more destructive than the physical conditions of his captivity. Political rivals inhabited medieval dungeons in extraordinary numbers, though their crimes were often simply being rivals at all. A king or lord would identify someone whose ambitions seemed threatening, someone whose popularity or influence seemed to exceed what could be safely tolerated. The solution was direct: remove them from circulation, confine them where they could pose no threat. Some were imprisoned for years, others died in their cells. The actual charges against them were often so vague as to be almost meaningless. Treason was a favourite accusation, though what specific treasonous acts they had committed was frequently never clearly established. The dungeon became a preemptive tool, a way of addressing a political problem before it had fully manifested. Debtors formed another substantial population in medieval dungeons. A person who owed money to the wrong person, who had fallen behind on taxes, or who had borrowed from a powerful creditor and found themselves unable to repay, could be imprisoned indefinitely until their debt was settled. But here was the cruel paradox. A person imprisoned in a dungeon has no means of earning money. They cannot work, cannot conduct business, cannot generate the funds necessary to pay what they owe. So they sat in darkness while their debt accumulated interest, while their family abandoned them or sold itself into poverty trying to secure their release, while the crushing impossibility of their situation slowly crushed their mind along with their spirit. Debtors' dungeons were sometimes separated from other sections acknowledged to be different spaces for a different type of prisoner, yet the conditions were often the same or worse. Spies occupied another category entirely. In an age before modern communication, information was power. A suspected spy could be imprisoned indefinitely while their interrogators attempted to extract information, or simply to remove them as a threat. These prisoners often experienced isolation more severe than others, confined in cells designed to prevent any communication with other inmates. A spy might be the only person in their section of the dungeon, with guards explicitly instructed to prevent them from seeing or hearing anyone else. For some, the goal was to extract confession or information through solitary confinement and psychological pressure. For others, the imprisonment itself was the punishment's slow erasure from the world. Religious prisoners formed a distinct and sometimes tragic category. Monks and scholars accused of heresy, of challenging church doctrine, or of criticizing powerful bishops found themselves in dungeons run by ecclesiastical authority. The Catholic Church maintained its own network of prisons, some of them as dark and hopeless as any secular fortress. A learned man might find himself imprisoned for opinions he had expressed, for texts he had read, or for questions he had asked. The dungeon became a tool for intellectual suppression, a way of removing troublesome voices before their ideas could spread too far. Some religious prisoners were eventually released. Many others simply disappeared from historical record, their fates unknown and seemingly unlamented. Women appeared in medieval dungeons far less frequently than men, but when they did, their imprisonments often carried particular dimensions of cruelty. A noblewoman imprisoned by a rival family faced not only confinement but also the threat of violation. A woman imprisoned for witchcraft faced not only the dungeon, but also the certainty that worse would follow: interrogation, torture, execution. The dungeon was sometimes a waiting room for women, a holding space before they proceeded to their actual punishment. Yet some women spent years imprisoned, their only crime being that they were female relatives of politically threatening men, held as hostages or leverage. What emerges from examining these diverse populations is a simple and devastating truth. Most people imprisoned in medieval dungeons were not there because of crimes they had committed. They were there because they existed in a position that made their imprisonment convenient for someone more powerful. They had become problems to be removed, questions to be silenced, threats to be neutralized. Justice was irrelevant. Law was a pretense. The dungeon was simply a tool, and it worked with terrible efficiency. Yet behind every door and every wall sat people with families, with memories, with thoughts and fears, and desperate hopes that someday, somehow, they might see sunlight again. To understand their stories is to understand that the dungeon was not merely an architectural space. It was a repository of human suffering, collected and preserved by those who wielded power with almost no restraint. And those who wielded that power, who made the decisions that sent people below, deserve their own examination. Who were the keepers of these dark places? What kind of person volunteered to live in such proximity to human suffering? The answers reveal something even more unsettling than the dungeons themselves. Above the prisoners, separate yet inextricably connected to their suffering, existed another population entirely: the jailers. These men, for they were almost always men, are the figures least discussed in histories of medieval confinement, yet they may be the most revealing. They were not lords or judges or political architects. They were not making the decisions that sent people below. Yet they were the ones who lived those decisions every single day. They were the hands that turned the lock. The voices that counted prisoners at dawn and dusk. The ears that heard screams and learned to distinguish between them the way a farmer learns to distinguish between the sounds of different animals. To understand the dungeon, we must understand the men who kept it. The role of jailer attracted a particular type of person. Medieval society had little formal category for this work. It was not a position in a guild, not something with clear training or advancement. Instead, jailers were drawn from the margins. Some were soldiers who had become too injured or too brutal, even for military service. Others were criminals themselves, given a choice between execution and accepting the position. A few were simply desperate men without other options, willing to accept work that no one else wanted. The king or lord would need someone to keep the dungeon, and there was always someone willing to do it in exchange for meagre wages and a place to sleep. The criteria for selection was straightforward: obedience and the ability to exist comfortably in proximity to suffering. A man who was too empathetic, too prone to question orders, was unsuitable. A man who flinched at screams was unsuitable. What was needed was someone whose conscience had already been sufficiently numbed by circumstance. Yet, contrary to what modern imagination might suggest, many jailers were not sadists. This is what makes the reality so unsettling. Most jailers were ordinary men performing a job. They would unlock cells in the morning. They would deliver bread and water sometimes. They would clean the cells when they became too fouled with human waste to be functional. They would listen to prisoners beg for mercy, beg for news from above, beg for death. And then they would lock the cells again and go to their own quarters. They would eat, they would sleep. They would wake and repeat the process. The routines became so normalized that many jailers, if asked to describe their work, would not emphasize the cruelty at all. To them, it was simply work. Necessary work. Work that someone had to do. The power held by jailers was real, yet circumscribed. They could not release a prisoner. They could not reduce a sentence. But within the dungeon itself, they held absolute authority. They decided how much food a prisoner received. They decided how often a cell would be emptied of waste. They decided whether a prisoner would receive water or be denied it. They decided whether a prisoner who fell ill would receive attention or be left to die. A jailer could make the difference between a prisoner surviving their confinement and a prisoner not surviving it. Yet this power was rarely wielded consciously as a tool for torture. It was wielded through neglect, through the simple inaction of not alleviating suffering. A jailer did not need to beat a prisoner to death. He simply needed to do nothing while the dungeon did the beating for him. Over time, something happened to men who spent years or decades as jailers. They developed a particular perspective on humanity. They saw people at their worst, desperate, degraded, begging, defecating in corners, slowly losing their minds. Year after year, they witnessed this degradation. And year after year, most of them became progressively less bothered by it. The initial revulsion, if it had ever existed, faded. The screams became background noise. The smell of unwashed bodies and decay became simply the smell of the dungeon. A jailer could spend 20 years in such a place and become so accustomed to it that when he finally left, the normal world would seem strange to him. Sunlight would seem too bright. The laughter of children would seem almost offensive. The complaints of free people would seem absurd. How could anyone complain about trivial matters when they were not locked in a cell? How could anyone worry about comfort when they had never known the dungeon? There is evidence that some jailers did develop attachments to certain prisoners, or at least developed a kind of professional respect for them. A prisoner who bore suffering with dignity, who did not whine or beg excessively, might receive slightly better treatment. A prisoner who caused no trouble might be overlooked when rations were being calculated, and thus receive a bit more. A prisoner who was educated or came from a noble family might be treated with a different tone. Not kindness exactly, but a form of recognition. Yet these moments of quasi-humanity occurred within a system that fundamentally dehumanized everyone involved: the prisoners below and the jailers above them. The recruitment and retention of jailers presents a paradox. Most men would instinctively recoil from such work, yet there was never a shortage of jailers. In a society where poverty was absolute and work was scarce, a position as jailer offered regular wages, a place to sleep, and a kind of power. A poor man or a desperate man could understand the appeal. And once a man had been a jailer for several years, he often could not imagine being anything else. He had become marked by the work. Other men would know what he had been. Regular society would regard him with a mixture of fear and contempt. He was useful to authority, but he was not respectable. He was not invited into the homes of merchants or craftsmen. He existed in a kind of parallel society, alongside the very people he confined. The psychological toll of this work manifested in different ways for different men. Some jailers became isolated and antisocial, preferring the company of prisoners to free men, because at least the dynamic was clear and predictable. Others became deliberately cruel outside of their work, overcompensating for the constraints they experienced within their professional role. Some drank excessively. Some became unexpectedly religious, as if constant exposure to human suffering had convinced them that another world must exist beyond this one. A few jailers kept detailed records of prisoners' names, crimes, dates of imprisonment, as if documentation itself could confer meaning on what they were doing. They were creating a record, a testament, perhaps a way of saying that these people had existed, that their suffering had been witnessed, even if that witness was the one man with the least power to prevent it. What emerges from studying the jailers is a truth that modern morality resists. Evil is not always carried out by monsters. It is often carried out by ordinary people working within systems that have become so normalized, so accepted, that they can perform terrible work while maintaining a clear conscience. The jailer was not a monster. He was simply a man who had learned to live in darkness, and darkness had changed him in ways both subtle and profound. Yet someone had to create the systems that allowed such men to exist. Someone had to write the laws that justified the dungeons. Someone had to build and maintain the institutional architecture that gave these prisons their authority. The question becomes not who were the keepers, but who gave them permission to keep. Imagine stepping out from the dungeon's darkness into a medieval town square on an early morning. Your eyes struggle to adjust to the light. The brightness itself is almost painful after the descriptions of what exists below. Yet this emergence is not a rescue. It is a transition from one form of confinement to another, from private suffering to public spectacle. Because if the dungeon was where authority concealed its power, the town square was where authority displayed it. And in medieval society, the display was often far more important than the reality. Medieval trials were not processes of inquiry designed to establish truth. They were performances. The verdict was often predetermined, determined by the power and connections of the accused, by the whims of the judge, by political considerations that had nothing to do with the actual facts of the case. What mattered was not whether the trial would discover the truth, but how convincingly the trial could perform the appearance of justice. A trial that was swift, public, and concluded with a sentence that satisfied the crowd was a successful trial. The facts were almost incidental. The narrative was everything. Consider the opening of such trials. Prisoners would be brought from their cells into daylight for the first time in months or years. The contrast was deliberately brutal. A person confined to darkness would be immediately disoriented by sunlight. Their pupils would dilate painfully. Their vision would blur. Their body would be overwhelmed by sensations that it could not process. This was not accidental. The authorities understood that a prisoner rendered vulnerable and confused by simple sensory shock was a prisoner less likely to resist, less likely to maintain composure, less likely to effectively defend themselves. The very process of removal from the dungeon was itself part of the punishment and part of the performance. The crowd would see a prisoner stumbling, squinting, barely able to stand. They would interpret this degradation as evidence of guilt. Few would consider that the prisoner was simply experiencing the physiological effects of emerging from months of darkness. The crowd itself was an essential component of the trial. These were not private proceedings in closed chambers. Trials were public events that could draw hundreds of people. The entire town would gather to watch. Merchants would abandon their stalls. Workers would leave their tasks. The trial was entertainment, and people understood it as such. They understood that they were being given something, a narrative, a conclusion, a confirmation that authority was functioning as it should. The trial provided a kind of reassurance. As long as trials continued to be held, as long as justice was being performed, people could tell themselves that order existed, that fairness existed, that the system, while harsh, was at least logical and coherent. The judges themselves understood the theatrical nature of their role. They dressed in robes and insignia designed to distinguish them from ordinary people. They spoke in formal language, often Latin or a highly stylized version of the local tongue. They made pronouncements from raised platforms, their words echoing across the square. Every element was designed to create psychological distance between the judge and the crowd, to suggest that the judge existed on a different plane, possessed of wisdom and authority beyond normal understanding. A judge could speak nonsense, or pronounce obviously unjust verdicts, and the performance itself would lend credibility to the words. The costume did the work. The theatre did the work. Confessions were particularly important in medieval justice. A confession was considered the highest form of proof. Yet how did one obtain a confession from someone who may well be innocent? The answer lay in the architecture of the trial itself. A prisoner was often tortured prior to the trial, and the torture was designed specifically to extract a confession. The prisoner would be placed in agony and informed that the pain would continue unless they confessed. Facing a choice between admitting to a crime they may not have committed or experiencing continued torture, most people confessed. They confessed to witchcraft, to murder, to treason, to whatever they were accused of. And when they stood in the town square during trial, already weakened by torture, already traumatized by their time in the dungeon, they would repeat these confessions. The crowd would hear these admissions of guilt, and the performance would reach its climax. The sentencing itself was choreographed with meticulous care. A judge would pronounce the verdict in formal language that made clear the judgment of authority. Sometimes the sentence was death. Sometimes it was mutilation, an ear cut off, a hand removed, a scar branded into the flesh. Sometimes it was imprisonment to return to the dungeon. But the critical element was that the sentence be pronounced in front of witnesses. The crowd would carry this memory forward. They would speak of it in their homes. They would tell their children about the trial they had witnessed. The message would propagate through the population. Authority is watching. Authority is judging. Authority is willing to punish. Disobey at your peril. The timing of trials often coincided with other public spectacles. Markets, festivals, religious celebrations, these were common times for trials to be held. The reason was strategic. Large crowds were already assembled. The authorities could maximize the audience for their performance. A trial held during a market day would be witnessed by people from dozens of surrounding villages. Each witness would return home and tell the story. The message would spread across the countryside. The king's justice reaches everywhere. Resistance is futile. The performance would be replicated in each retelling, growing in some ways, being simplified in others, but always maintaining the core message. Authority is absolute and inevitable. What is remarkable about medieval justice is how consistently it confused spectacle with legitimacy. As long as the trial was performed convincingly, as long as the crowd was satisfied with the show, the system maintained its credibility even when it was fundamentally unjust. Innocent people were convicted. Guilty people went free because they possessed the right connections. Yet the system persisted because most people never saw the contradictions. They saw only the trial, only the performance. They saw authority displaying itself, and they accepted it. Yet every trial had an ending that extended beyond the town square. Every sentenced prisoner faced a fate after judgment. Some were executed in public, their deaths incorporated into the performance itself. Others were returned to the dungeon. Some were released, though often broken by their experience. A few managed to escape, though escape meant becoming fugitives hunted across the countryside. What happened to these people after the trial concluded, after the crowd dispersed, after the town square returned to normal commercial activity, is a story that was rarely recorded. The performance had concluded. The audience had gone home. Authority had no interest in what happened next. Yet it is in these forgotten aftermath stories that some of the most profound truths about medieval justice emerged, truths about mercy, escape, survival, and the ways that people adapted to lives shattered by the machinery of authority. Once the trial ended and the crowd dispersed, once the judge removed his robes and returned to his comfortable chambers, once the executioner cleaned his tools and the town square became ordinary again, something else began. It was quieter than the trial, less theatrical, less witnessed. It was the endurance of confinement itself, the experience of those prisoners who were not executed, who were not released, who were simply forgotten in the darkness they had been sent to inhabit. For many of them, the true punishment was not the trial or the conviction. It was what came after. It was time itself, transformed into something unrecognizable. The human mind requires temporal markers. We know that time is passing because things change around us. The sun rises and sets, seasons shift, people age. Yet a prisoner in a dungeon cell experiences almost none of these markers. If the cell has no window, there is no sunrise and sunset. If a prisoner is kept in solitary confinement, there are no other people to observe aging. If the cell is maintained at a constant temperature and humidity, there is no seasonal change. What remains? Perhaps the arrival of a guard with food, perhaps the sound of a bell ringing somewhere far overhead, perhaps nothing at all. For a prisoner in such conditions, time becomes abstract, theoretical. After weeks, the distinction between day and night dissolves. After months, the prisoner loses track of seasons. After a year, many prisoners could not accurately say how much time had actually passed. Some believed years had elapsed when only months had. Others believed months had elapsed when actually years had gone by. This dissolution of temporal perception created a particular kind of suffering that was rarely discussed in medieval accounts of imprisonment. It was not painful in an acute sense. It created instead a kind of existential vertigo. A prisoner's sense of self was partly constructed from their memory of events, their ability to anticipate future events, and their understanding of where they existed in a timeline stretching from past to future. Remove all external temporal markers, and this sense of self begins to fragment. A prisoner might spend hours or days trying to remember what day they were arrested. They might struggle to recall if their trial happened last month or last year. They might find themselves uncertain of their own age. Names became slippery. A prisoner might suddenly realize that they could not remember their mother's face or their wife's voice. These memories had not disappeared exactly, they were still there somewhere in the mind, but they had become unreliable, uncertain. They might remember things that had never actually happened. They might forget events that had been central to their lives. Some prisoners attempted to maintain temporal markers themselves. They would scratch marks on the walls, 1 mark per day, or 1 mark per week. Some would sing or recite poems at regular intervals, using the recitation itself as a way to structure time. Others would count. Simply count, up and down, as a way of creating the illusion that time was progressing in a measurable way. These activities often began as conscious efforts to maintain sanity, but they sometimes became compulsive behaviors that outlasted their original purpose. A prisoner might continue scratching marks on a wall long after the marks had become so numerous as to be meaningless. They would continue counting long after the numbers ceased to represent anything. The behavior had become the point itself, proof of existence, proof that they were still present and still capable of action, however meaningless. It is from these attempts to mark time that we have our most direct access to the interior lives of medieval dungeon prisoners. Many dungeons that have been excavated or preserved show marks carved into walls, sometimes orderly rows, suggesting systematic counting, sometimes chaotic scratches, suggesting desperation or madness. And alongside these marks, prisoners often left other kinds of carvings, names, not always their own names, sometimes names of loved ones, or names of saints, or simply patterns that repeated. Prayers carved into stone, sometimes repeated dozens of times, the words wearing grooves deeper into the wall with each retelling. Drawings, crude images of birds, or crosses, or faces. The scratching of a person trying to create beauty or meaning in absolute darkness. Some prisoners created more elaborate compositions, scenes of the world above, as remembered or imagined. A dungeon wall excavated in France shows an elaborate carving of a fortified town, detailed enough that historians were able to identify it as the prisoner's hometown. The prisoner had spent unknown amounts of time scratching this image into stone, recreating the world he could no longer see. These carvings represent something profound about the human need for meaning and permanence. A prisoner knew, with varying degrees of certainty, that he would likely die in the dungeon. He might hope for release, but hope itself was a painful thing that often had to be suppressed to maintain psychological stability. Yet he could not accept absolute meaninglessness. So he carved. He scratched his name into stone so that if anyone ever came after, they would know that he had existed. He carved prayers as a way of maintaining contact with the divine, as if the act of carving brought him closer to God. He drew images as a way of keeping memories alive of people, places, experiences that time and isolation were erasing from his mind. The carvings were acts of defiance, in a way, not defiance of his captors that would have been suicidal, but defiance of oblivion, a refusal to disappear without leaving a trace. Yet most of these traces disappeared anyway. Dungeons were reconstructed, walls were rebuilt, stones were repurposed, prisoners died and were forgotten. The records that might have preserved their names and stories were not kept, or were lost in fires, or were deemed too insignificant to maintain. The only evidence that these people had existed is what remains scratched into stone, and even that has largely vanished. Historians have found some carvings in a few preserved dungeons, a name here, a date there, a prayer repeated dozens of times on a single wall. But for every carving that survives, there were doubtless thousands that did not. There were thousands of prisoners whose names are completely unknown, whose faces would never be remembered, whose suffering left no mark on history beyond the dungeon walls themselves. What is haunting about these carvings is that they represent the absolute minimum of human need. A person stripped of freedom, of autonomy, of hope, reduced to nothing but a prisoner in a cell even then, that person still needed to mark their existence, still needed to say, I was here. I was real. I was a person with a name and memories and faith. These scratches in stone are perhaps the most honest testimony we have to what the dungeon truly was. Not a place of grand justice or political consequence. Simply a place where human beings, stripped of everything, attempted to maintain some minimal assertion of existence, and then disappeared, leaving only faint scratches that future people would eventually discover and puzzle over, trying to understand what voice had reached across centuries to whisper, remember that I existed. Beyond the walls of these dungeons, in the towns and villages that surrounded them, these prisons became legendary. Stories grew, rumors multiplied. The true history of the dungeon was lost, and in its place arose something more powerful, the mythology of the dungeon. And it is this mythology, these stories told by people who had never seen inside the dark chambers, that shaped how society understood imprisonment, punishment, and power itself. In the villages surrounding medieval castles and fortresses, the dungeon existed primarily as imagination. Most ordinary people never saw inside one. Most never saw a prisoner extracted from its depths. Yet the dungeon shaped their lives and their minds more profoundly than many things they experienced directly. The reason was simple. The dungeon could not be fully known, and therefore it could not be fully explained. What cannot be explained becomes subject to invention. And in the space between reality and invention, mythology flourished. The stories began simply enough. Someone had heard screaming coming from beneath a castle at night. Someone had glimpsed a prisoner being transported. Someone had known a person who disappeared and was rumored to be imprisoned somewhere below. These fragments of reality, combined with speculation and the natural human tendency to fill in unknown details with imagination, generated stories. The stories spread from person to person, changing slightly with each retelling, accumulating details and explanations that transformed raw facts into something far stranger. A prisoner held for political reasons became a prisoner held for unspeakable crimes. A dungeon's natural dampness and decay became the signs of deliberate torture and slow death. A prisoner who died of illness became a prisoner who was left to waste away as punishment. Each retelling added weight and texture to the narrative. Ghosts became inevitable in such an environment. A person who died imprisoned below ground, whose body might never be recovered, who left no grave to be visited or mourned, such a person was perfectly positioned to become a ghost in the popular imagination. The villagers would speak of seeing lights in the castle at night below thee, wisps that were actually the spirits of dead prisoners, unable to find peace because their deaths had been unacknowledged and unrecorded. They would speak of hearing sounds, echoing from the ground, beneath the castle moans, and whispers that were the voices of the imprisoned. They would describe the bells of the castle tolling unexpectedly and attribute the sound to phantoms attempting to ring for help. None of these stories were entirely fabricated. Castles do have unexplained noises. Stones do settle and shift, creating sounds that can seem almost human. Light can be refracted in ways that create illusions. The difference between reality and mythology is often just a matter of interpretation. What is crucial to understand is that these stories were not discouraged by those in power. On the contrary, they were often tolerated, and sometimes actively encouraged. A lord who allowed rumors of his dungeon to spread rumors of torture, of spirits, of absolute inescapability was cultivating fear among his subjects, without expending effort or resources. The rumor did the work that the dungeon itself could not do. It made people obedient, not through direct coercion, but through dread of invisible punishment. A person living in a village at the base of a castle, surrounded by stories of imprisoned ghosts and supernatural torments, would be naturally inclined toward obedience. They would not need guards in every corner or constant surveillance. Fear would manage their behavior. Fear of the dungeon they could never see. The relationship between rulers and these ghost stories was symbiotic. A ruler allowed the stories to propagate, even sometimes contributing to them through subtle hints or deliberate misdirection. A prisoner would disappear, and the lord would make no announcement, allowing villagers to speculate wildly about what had happened. Had the prisoner been executed? Had they been imprisoned below? Had they escaped? The uncertainty created space for stories to flourish. And once the stories flourished, the lord could benefit from the reputation without having to maintain the reality. In some cases, the reputation was far more effective than the reality. It cost nothing to allow people to believe that the dungeon was worse than it actually was. In fact, a dungeon whose reputation exceeded its actual conditions was remarkably efficient. It was a tool of power that required minimal maintenance. Over generations, these stories became crystallized into folklore. They took on patterns and structures that repeated across different castles in different regions. Every major castle was said to have a particular ghost, a lady who had been imprisoned for refusing to marry, a knight who had been betrayed and locked away, a scholar who had died studying forbidden knowledge. The details varied, but the structure remained consistent. In retelling these stories year after year, generation after generation, they became almost more real than the historical facts they had originally been derived from. Children would learn the ghost stories as part of their cultural knowledge. They would hear them around fires at night. They would be taught them as cautionary tales about what happened to people who disobeyed authority. The folklore became a mechanism of social control that was more effective than any formal legal system could be. Interestingly, many of the ghost stories that emerged from medieval dungeons survive to the present day. Modern ghost hunting shows and paranormal investigations often focus on castles and old fortifications, seeking evidence of supernatural activity. The investigators are typically unaware that the ghost stories they are investigating may well have originated in these medieval dungeons. The spectre of a woman in white haunting a castle tower might be a distorted remnant of a story about a noblewoman imprisoned centuries ago. The phantom soldier seen pacing the walls might be derived from tales of a knight locked in a cell. The disembodied voices heard in the depths of an old fortress might echo down from stories about the cries of prisoners. Modern people, seeking paranormal explanations for mysteries, are sometimes simply rediscovering medieval propaganda stories that were created not because supernatural events actually occurred, but because fear of punishment needed to be maintained in populations. The monks and scholars who lived during the medieval period sometimes recorded these stories, preserving them in manuscripts and chronicles. But they did so with a particular slant. Religious writers often interpreted the ghost stories through a theological lens, suggesting that the spirits were either demons that haunted places of sin and cruelty, or souls in purgatory seeking prayer and redemption. This reframing transformed simple stories of fear into narratives about divine judgment and spiritual consequences. A prisoner's ghost was no longer simply the echo of a murdered person. It became a sign that God was aware of injustice, that divine judgment would eventually balance earthly wrongs. This interpretation was comforting to religious people, as it suggested that while earthly authority was absolute and unaccountable, heavenly authority existed beyond it and would eventually set all things right. What emerges from examining these rumors and ghost stories is a picture of medieval society in which imagination and propaganda were inextricably intertwined. The dungeon was simultaneously real and legendary, actual and mythical. It was a physical structure that existed beneath castles, but it was also a psychological space that existed in the minds of everyone who had heard stories about it. This dual existence made it remarkably powerful. A person could fear the dungeon even if they had never seen it, had never seen a prisoner, had never directly experienced any punishment. The fear was real, even if its object was partly mythological. And it was precisely this quality, this ability to frighten without displaying itself, that made the medieval dungeon such an effective tool of power. Yet beneath these popular rumors and ghost stories, another layer of record existed. In monasteries and cathedrals, in the archives maintained by religious institutions, certain facts about dungeons were being preserved. These were not the melodramatic stories told by villagers around fires. They were more prosaic, records of imprisonment, accounts of trials, documents that occasionally mentioned prisoners by name. These records were not widely known, not part of popular folklore. They existed in a separate sphere, the sphere of literacy, of institutional memory, of the knowledge kept by those who could read and write. And it is in these hidden archives that the truest stories of the medieval dungeon are preserved, waiting to be discovered centuries later by people willing to look beyond the comfortable myths. There exists a particular category of medieval manuscript that was never meant to be found. These are documents that sit in library archives, often labelled with vague institutional designations, sometimes only partially translated, frequently overlooked by casual researchers. They are the accounts written by monks and scribes who possessed both the literacy to record events and the moral conviction to do so despite the danger. These chronicles represent something almost incomprehensible to the modern mind, an act of rebellion conducted through writing itself. To write certain truths in certain times and places was to risk everything. Yet some people did it anyway. The monks who inhabited monasteries and cathedral scriptoriums lived in a peculiar position relative to power. They were technically under the authority of bishops and archbishops, who were themselves subject to kings and lords. Yet they also possessed something that most people did not: literacy, access to writing materials, and the legitimacy to keep records. A monk's primary duty was to copy religious texts and maintain institutional records. But in maintaining these records, a monk sometimes encountered information that raised moral questions. A prisoner brought to the cathedral seeking sanctuary, a lord's confession of injustice, a rumor of a prisoner who had died under unclear circumstances. What was a monk to do with such information? To report it up the chain of authority was to ensure that nothing would happen. The Lord would simply deny the story, and the monk might face punishment for speaking against authority. But to remain silent was to become complicit in injustice. Some monks solved this dilemma through a practice that was both courageous and cunning. They recorded the truth in places where it might survive, even if authority attempted to suppress it. They wrote in marginalia, in the narrow spaces between columns of sacred text, in footnotes, in the spaces between lines. They wrote in abbreviated Latin that required knowledge to decipher. They recorded names and dates in combinations that might seem random to a casual reader, but which encoded precise information for someone who knew how to read them. They embedded truthful accounts within longer passages of official narrative, burying dangerous information beneath layers of acceptable text. In doing so, they created a hidden historical record that existed parallel to the official historical record, a truth that might survive, precisely because it was not immediately obvious. One of the most remarkable aspects of these hidden records is how often they contradict the official narratives created by authority. An official chronicle might record that a prisoner was executed justly for obvious crimes. The marginalia in a monastic manuscript might contain the real name of the prisoner, the actual date of imprisonment, and a note indicating that the prisoner's only crime was opposing the Lord. An official record might claim that a particular lord was universally beloved and died peacefully. A monk's private record might indicate that the lord was widely hated and died suspiciously, possibly poisoned. These discrepancies are not always dramatic or world-altering, but they accumulate. They suggest that the official historical record is not a reliable reflection of what actually happened. What is particularly intriguing is evidence that some monks deliberately distorted their own official records, even while keeping more truthful accounts hidden. This was a sophisticated form of resistance. A monk might write an official chronicle that presented authorities' preferred narrative, a lord's version of events, a king's interpretation of a trial, the official explanation for a prisoner's death. But the same monk might simultaneously maintain a separate, hidden record that told a different story. To any observer who read only the official chronicle, authorities' narrative would appear to be the historical record. But anyone who gained access to the hidden records would discover that the official chronicle was itself a form of fiction. The truth had been preserved, but concealed. Medieval authorities eventually understood that monks were sometimes writing forbidden truths, and they responded with various forms of control. Some monasteries were placed under direct supervision. Some monks were forbidden from maintaining independent records. Some monasteries were ordered to turn over their archives for inspection, and documents were removed or destroyed. Yet because of the decentralized nature of the medieval church, it was impossible to suppress all such records. Some survived in monasteries that were remote or powerful enough to resist oversight. Some survived because they were hidden so carefully that they were simply never found during inspections. Some survived because they were written in such obscure forms that even if they were discovered, no one could easily decipher what they actually said. The problem with relying on these hidden records is that they are themselves subject to interpretation and bias. A monk might record information faithfully, but they might also interpret events through their own theological framework. They might embellish a story they found compelling. They might make errors in transcription or understanding. And because these documents exist somewhat outside the official historical record, there is less corroborating evidence to check them against. Yet this very marginality is also what lends them credibility. A monk with nothing to gain from lying, recording information that directly contradicted authority, risking punishment for doing so, such a person's testimony, has a weight that official pronouncements do not possess. What complicates our understanding of medieval history is that subsequent generations of historians and chroniclers sometimes used these hidden monastic records to construct their own narratives, and those narratives were not always faithful to the original sources. A 17th century historian reading a medieval monk's account of a medieval lord's cruelty might embellish the story, or reinterpret it to serve contemporary political purposes. A Victorian historian might emphasize certain aspects of medieval punishment and ignore others, shaped by the concerns and morality of their own era. What we think we know about medieval dungeons and medieval justice may itself be a construction derived from hidden medieval sources, but filtered through the interpretative frameworks of subsequent centuries. This raises a disturbing question. To what extent is the history we have inherited not a faithful record of what actually happened, but rather a series of translations and reinterpretations that have drifted further and further from the original sources? A medieval monk records the true name of a prisoner. A later historian reads this name and creates a narrative about who the prisoner was and why they were imprisoned. A Victorian historian reads this narrative and adds details and context derived from their own assumptions about medieval society. A modern historian reads the Victorian interpretation and takes it as fact. Somewhere in this chain of transmission, the original truth has been buried beneath layers of interpretation, all of them shaped by the assumptions and needs of the people doing the interpreting. Some of the most dramatic historical facts we have about medieval dungeons and medieval punishment may actually be inventions that developed centuries after the fact. A particular torture device described in detail in a 19th century book might have been imagined by that author, embellished from a fragmentary reference found in a medieval source, or misunderstood from a description of an object that served a completely different purpose. We have accepted these descriptions as historical fact without realizing that they are relatively modern constructions. We have built our understanding of medieval cruelty partly on fabrications and partly on real events that have been distorted beyond recognition. Yet the hidden monastic records preserve something that cannot be dismissed. They preserve witness. They preserve accounts of individual people, prisoners, whose names were recorded, whose imprisonments were noted, whose fates were sometimes recorded. They preserve the memory of specific acts of injustice, specific moments when authority reached down and claimed a person. These records may not tell us the complete truth about medieval dungeons, but they tell us that the dungeons were real, that the imprisonment was real, and that at least some people at the time understood that what was happening required moral condemnation. The monks who wrote these hidden chronicles were saying, "This happened, and I am recording it so that someday someone will know that it happened." They could not stop the injustice, but they could bear witness to it. And bearing witness, preserving truth in a hidden form, was itself a form of resistance. Yet what these written records tell us represents only a fraction of the story. The walls themselves contain evidence that words cannot convey. In the architecture, in the physical structures that remain from medieval dungeons, in the material traces of human presence, there exists a form of testimony that no subsequent interpreter can completely distort. This is the testimony that only the dungeon itself can provide. In recent decades, archaeologists have begun to uncover what centuries of history had buried. Beneath European castles and fortresses, in foundations that seemed long forgotten, in spaces that had been sealed off or built over, teams of researchers have discovered the physical remnants of medieval dungeons. Each discovery is incremental. A stone wall that extends deeper underground than historians had previously realized. A series of cells carved into bedrock. A network of passages that served no visible practical purpose except to hold people. The discoveries themselves are not always dramatic. Often, a dungeon is found not through deliberate excavation, but through accident. A building project requires foundation work. A surveyor notices structural irregularities. A renovation reveals a sealed chamber that had been hidden for centuries. And in these moments, when sunlight first reaches into spaces that had not seen light for hundreds of years, the material evidence of medieval confinement emerges. What archaeologists find in these unearthed dungeons is often surprisingly mundane. There are no instruments of torture displayed as prominently as popular imagination might suggest. Instead, there are the everyday objects that constitute imprisonment. Iron locks, corroded and encrusted with rust, preserved in almost perfect condition by the constant moisture and the absence of oxygen that characterize dungeon environments. These locks are remarkably sophisticated for their era, featuring mechanisms designed not to break easily, but to resist tampering. Someone spent considerable effort designing these locks. Someone wanted to ensure that once a door was locked, it would remain locked unless opened by someone who possessed the specific key. Some locks have been opened by archaeologists using methods that have taken weeks of careful work, suggesting that a prisoner attempting to pick or force such a lock would have faced nearly impossible odds. Chains have also been recovered from medieval dungeons. Iron chains, sometimes still attached to the walls at anchor points, sometimes found coiled on the floor where they were abandoned centuries ago. These chains are heavier than modern chains, forged by hand from iron and attached to walls or to collars and shackles designed to immobilize a person. Yet what is remarkable about most chains recovered from dungeons is that they show minimal signs of struggle. There are no deep gouges suggesting that a prisoner attempted frantically to break free. There are no sharp bends indicating that someone twisted violently within the constraints. Instead, the chains remain relatively undamaged, which suggests either that prisoners accepted their confinement with minimal physical resistance, or that they recognized the futility of resistance so quickly that extended struggle never developed. Either way, the chains speak of a particular kind of despair, not the dramatic despair of violent resistance, but the quieter despair of acceptance. Tools have been discovered in some dungeons, though their presence raises more questions than it answers. Iron implements that might have been used for maintenance or torture. Wooden implements worn smooth by years of handling. In a few cases, tools appear to have been deliberately broken or destroyed, suggesting that perhaps a prisoner, or even a jailer, had attempted to make something that had been confiscated. Without additional context, these tools are difficult to interpret. Were they instruments of punishment? Tools for maintenance? Objects that a prisoner had attempted to fashion into implements of escape? The ambiguity is itself revealing. We want the material evidence to speak clearly to us, to tell us definitively what happened in these spaces. But the objects remain silent, allowing us to project our assumptions onto them. The graffiti and carvings that archaeologists discover are far more eloquent. A name scratched into stone with a sharp object. A cross repeated many times, worn deeper into the wall with each repetition of the act. A crude drawing of a face, or a building, or abstract patterns that resist interpretation. These carvings often cluster in corners or on lower sections of walls, suggesting that prisoners may have been sitting on the floor when they created them. The effort involved in carving into stone with improvised tools would have been considerable. A prisoner would need to find or fashion a sharp object capable of cutting into stone. They would need to position themselves in front of the wall in a way that allowed them to work. They would need to repeat the action over and over, sometimes dozens of times in the case of repeated symbols or prayers. This required patience, motivation, and access to time. A prisoner involved in constant labor would not have had opportunity for such work. The presence of extensive carvings might suggest that some prisoners experienced long periods of solitude in which they had little to do but mark the walls. In one particularly well-preserved dungeon in southern France, archaeologists discovered an entire calendar carved into a wall. Marks arranged in rows that clearly indicated a counting system, with variations that appeared to mark weekly or monthly cycles. The calendar extended for what appeared to be several years of continuous marking. A prisoner had spent those years marking each day, creating a visual representation of the time passing. Was this an act of hope, a way of believing that time was still progressing, and that eventually the confinement would end? Was it an act of despair, a way of tracking how much of life had been spent in that space? Or was it simply a way of maintaining some form of mental order in an environment that offered nothing to structure consciousness? The calendar remains, and we can count the marks and calculate how long this person was imprisoned. But the meaning of the calendar, the emotional content that motivated its creation, remains irreducible. Some dungeons have yielded organic material, bone, wood, cloth that has been preserved by the dry stone and the sealed environment. Hair and fiber remnants that can be analyzed for disease markers or diet. Bone analysis that can reveal age, sex, and indicators of malnutrition or physical strain. These scientific approaches to the material evidence allow us to reconstruct something of the physical experience of imprisonment. A prisoner confined for extended periods shows signs of vitamin deficiencies, of weak bone structure, of diseases associated with poor sanitation and damp environments. We can examine these remains and understand something about what the body experienced, even when we cannot know what the mind experienced. What is most striking about the physical evidence of medieval dungeons is how it humanizes the people we know so little about. The graffiti connects us across centuries to people who attempted to assert their existence by carving their mark into stone. The chains speak of confinement so complete that resistance seemed futile. The bones speak of bodies broken by confinement, by poor nutrition, by the physical toll of imprisonment. And the locks speak of a system so carefully designed that it could confine and contain human beings with minimal direct violence. The dungeon becomes not just a historical curiosity, but a kind of testimony, a preserved record of human suffering that was not intended to be preserved. The dungeon's builders thought they were creating a space that would last forever. They did not anticipate that centuries later, people would unearth their work and attempt to read its meaning. What these material traces teach us is something that words and records cannot fully convey, that the dungeon was not theoretical, not abstract, not a metaphor for authority and power. It was real. The stone was real, the cold was real, the darkness was real, the people trapped within were real. And while we can never fully understand what it felt like to exist in such places, we can at least acknowledge that it happened. We can stand in the presence of the physical remnants and recognize that we are looking at more than just architecture. We are looking at the fossilized record of human endurance, human despair, and human determination to assert meaning in the face of absolute constraint. The walls remember, even when the people who lived within them are long forgotten. And in remembering the walls, we begin to restore some measure of dignity to the forgotten people they once confined. Behind every dungeon existed people whose names have been almost entirely erased from history. They were the architects, the master masons, the engineers who designed and built these spaces. Unlike the jailers, who left minimal trace in historical records, these builders would have been relatively prominent figures in their time. A master mason who could design a secure fortress was a valuable person, sought after by lords and kings, paid well for their expertise. Yet the dungeons they designed have been largely attributed to the historical figures who commissioned them to kings and lords whose names survived in chronicles, while the builders themselves disappeared into anonymity. We know almost nothing about who these people were, what they thought about their work, whether they experienced any moral conflict about creating spaces designed to confine human beings. What we do know comes from examining the structures themselves and attempting to trace them to known workshops and architectural movements. Certain dungeons show design innovations that appear in multiple locations, suggesting that successful designs were copied and refined. The architecture of dungeon confinement follows recognizable patterns. Certain positioning of cells relative to entrances, specific wall thicknesses, particular approaches to ventilation and water management. These patterns suggest not random construction but intentional design based on accumulated knowledge about how to contain prisoners effectively. Someone had thought carefully about the problem of confinement. Someone had worked out solutions. Someone had documented these solutions in a way that could be transmitted to other builders in other places. The sophistication of medieval fortress design is often underestimated. A master mason working in the 13th or 14th century was engaged in complex engineering. They needed to design walls that could withstand siege weapons. They needed to calculate angles that would allow defenders to see approaching attackers while remaining protected themselves. They needed to design water systems that would supply the fortress with fresh water while preventing poisoning or cutting of the supply. And if the fortress included a dungeon, they needed to design spaces that would reliably contain prisoners without requiring constant guard presence or intervention. These were genuine engineering challenges, and the solutions developed by medieval masons represent real intellectual achievement. Yet this is where the contradiction becomes most stark. A master mason might spend part of their career designing beautiful cathedral structures that were intended to inspire awe and transport the viewer towards spiritual transcendence. The same mason, in another part of their career, might design dungeon structures that were intended to break the human spirit and render a person incapable of resistance. Both projects required creativity, both required problem-solving, both demonstrated mastery of materials and structure, but they served radically different purposes, expressed different values, embodied contradictory aspirations about what architecture should do. There is no evidence that medieval masons experienced moral qualms about this duality. A master mason was a craftsman. They took commissions. They built what they were asked to build. If a lord commissioned a cathedral, they would build a cathedral. If a lord commissioned a dungeon, they would build a dungeon. The moral character of the structure was not their concern. Their concern was whether the structure would accomplish what the lord wanted it to accomplish. In this respect, medieval masons were not fundamentally different from modern engineers who design weapons systems or surveillance infrastructure. The craftsperson's role is often separated from the use to which their craft is put. The moral responsibility could be displaced onto the person issuing the commission. Yet it would be wrong to entirely absolve the builders of agency or responsibility. A master mason advising a lord on fortress design had significant power over what was actually built. They made choices about dimensions, materials, and structural approaches. They could have suggested designs that were less effective at confining prisoners. They could have left flaws in the design that would have allowed escape. They could have refused the commission. Some may well have done so, though we have no records of such refusals. Instead, what we see in the archaeological record are dungeons of remarkable effectiveness spaces that clearly represent the intentional application of considerable expertise toward the goal of secure confinement. The most unsettling aspect of medieval dungeon design is how refined it became. The earliest dungeons, perhaps dating to the 9th or 10th century, were relatively crude, simple underground spaces with minimal engineering sophistication. But by the 12th and 13th centuries, dungeon design had evolved into something remarkably sophisticated. The placement of cells was calculated to minimize sound transmission while maximizing control by guards. The dimensions of cells were precisely calibrated large enough that a prisoner could not injure themselves by crashing against walls, but small enough that psychological discomfort was unavoidable. The positioning of ventilation was designed to move air in patterns that would prevent accumulation of noxious fumes, while simultaneously creating the unsettling sensation of wind through the space. These were not accidents. These were the deliberate choices of people who understood the psychological and physical effects of spatial design. Some architectural innovations developed for dungeons later influenced other types of fortification and civilian architecture. The techniques for creating strong walls through specific bonding patterns, for designing access points that could be easily defended, for planning sightlines, that allowed observation of interior spaces from limited vantage points. All of these innovations had military and security applications beyond imprisonment. A master mason who developed an innovative lock mechanism for a dungeon might find that the same innovation was adopted for other types of secure storage. In this way, innovations born from the need to confine humans could be adapted to other purposes, spreading the architectural language of control throughout medieval society. There exists a particular irony in the fact that dungeon design required genuine aesthetic consideration. The spaces needed to be functional, certainly, but they also needed to be monumental to communicate authority through sheer weight of stone and engineering. A dungeon could be a crude hole in the ground and still function to hold prisoners. But a dungeon designed by a master mason was often something more. A carefully proportioned space where even the darkness itself seemed calculated and intentional. The walls met at precise angles. The ceiling heights were deliberate. The space had a kind of terrible beauty to it. The beauty of perfect functionality. The aesthetic of pure purpose. A prisoner entering such a space would not only be psychologically affected by confinement, but also by the unmistakable message that this space had been specifically designed to contain them. The care taken in the design conveyed that their imprisonment was not incidental or unfortunate, but essential to someone's intentions. The master masons who designed these spaces lived within the same medieval worldview that we have been exploring throughout this narrative. They lived within a society that accepted hierarchy as natural, that understood authority as divinely ordained, that saw imprisonment and punishment as necessary tools for maintaining order. To a medieval mason, designing a dungeon for a lord was simply an extension of their craft, an application of their skills to the purposes that authority required. The mason was not unusual or morally exceptional for undertaking such work. They were simply a professional serving their society in the way that professionals were expected to serve. Yet this very normalcy is what makes the historical picture so disturbing. Evil did not require evil people. Evil required only that ordinary people apply their talents and skills toward purposes that authority deemed necessary. The dungeons that remain standing today stand as monuments not only to the power of medieval lords, but also to the considerable talents of the people who built them. Walking through such a space, examining the precision of the stonework, understanding the sophistication of the engineering, we are forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. That cruelty, when backed by resources and expertise, can be very well crafted indeed. The builders of these spaces possessed real knowledge and real skill. They used that knowledge and skill to create suffering, and in doing so they contributed to a system of control that shaped medieval society for centuries. To understand the dungeon is to understand that oppression is not necessarily crude or unsophisticated. Oppression can be elegant. Oppression can be technically accomplished. Oppression can represent genuine human achievement in the service of genuinely inhuman purposes. In medieval Christian theology, suffering held a particular significance. It was not merely punishment for transgressions. It was understood as a pathway to purification, a form of suffering that could, if endured correctly, bring a soul closer to redemption. Christ himself had suffered. The saints had endured torment. Martyrs had died in agony. These experiences were not tragedies to be mourned, but spiritual achievements to be honored. Within this framework, the dungeon acquired a new dimension. It was not only a tool of political control, it was also, potentially, a space of spiritual transformation. A person imprisoned could understand their suffering not merely as punishment for crimes, but as an opportunity for spiritual cleansing. Their pain could become a form of prayer. Their isolation could become a form of contemplation. Their degradation could become a form of humility before God. The dungeon became a kind of substitute monastery, a place of retreat from the world, though one imposed by force rather than chosen voluntarily. This theological interpretation of imprisonment made certain things possible that would otherwise have seemed morally problematic. How could a king sentence someone to decades of suffering and darkness without feeling responsibility for that suffering? How could priests bless such actions without recognizing them as violations of Christian compassion? The answer lay in reframing suffering as spiritual benefit. If a prisoner's suffering was purifying their soul, then the king who imposed the suffering was, in a sense, doing the prisoner a spiritual favor. The priest who blessed the cell was not endorsing cruelty. The priest was witnessing a sacred transformation. The chains became instruments of grace. The darkness became a context for spiritual illumination. The suffering became redemptive. Monasteries and cathedral chapters maintained careful records of their spiritual practices, and from these records we can glimpse how religious authority approached dungeons and prisoners. Bishops would authorize the imprisonment of heretics and schismatics, viewing the dungeon as an appropriate punishment because it forced the prisoner to confront their errors in isolation, with nothing but their own conscience and the presence of God. Monks would sometimes visit imprisoned prisoners, bringing not comfort, but spiritual direction. They would advise the prisoner on how to interpret their suffering, how to transform it into prayer, how to use their time in confinement for spiritual advancement. Some prisoners seem to have embraced this framework. Historical records contain accounts of prisoners who spent their confinement in prayer, who spoke of spiritual visions experienced in their cells, who allegedly achieved states of spiritual enlightenment through their suffering. Whether these accounts are historically accurate or represent idealized later interpretations, they demonstrate that the framework was available to prisoners, that suffering could be reinterpreted through religious language. Certain practices emerged that formalized this spiritualization of imprisonment. In some monasteries and cathedral dungeons, cells were designed with small openings high in the walls that allowed sunlight to enter, creating spaces where a prisoner could see light even if they could not see what lay beyond the walls. This light was often interpreted spiritually as the presence of God, as grace penetrating even the dungeon's darkness. Some dungeons included places where prisoners could see or hear religious services being conducted in the cathedral or monastery above. A prisoner might hear chanting from the level above, or bells tolling for prayer times, or the faint sounds of hymns. These auditory penetrations of the dungeon became spiritual touchstones. They reminded the prisoner that they existed within a religious community, that authority itself was grounded in divine will, and that their suffering occurred within a structure of cosmic meaning, rather than mere arbitrary cruelty. The Church maintained its own system of imprisonment separate from secular dungeons, though the two systems were often coordinated. Ecclesiastical prisons held heretics, priests accused of sexual misconduct or theft, monks who had violated their vows. These religious prisoners faced a particular set of circumstances. They were imprisoned by the very institution whose authority they had violated or questioned. The psychological effect was profound. A heretic imprisoned by the Church was surrounded by constant reminders of the authority whose theology they had rejected. They would hear religious services. They would be visited by priests attempting to convince them to recant their heresies. They might be placed in solitary confinement with nothing but religious texts to read and religious instruction to contemplate. The dungeon became an instrument specifically designed to break religious resistance and produce theological conformity. What is particularly striking is how often prisoners imprisoned in ecclesiastical dungeons eventually recanted their heresies or confessed their errors. Some of these recantations were undoubtedly coerced through torture or the prospect of execution, but others appear to have been genuine prisoners who, after months or years of isolation and religious instruction, genuinely came to believe that they had been wrong. Whether this represented actual spiritual transformation or psychological breakdown, it served the Church's purposes equally well. A prisoner who recanted and was released would carry forward the message that resistance to Church authority was spiritually as well as physically painful. A prisoner who recanted and was executed could be portrayed as having achieved salvation through confession and acceptance of Church authority. The language used to describe imprisonment in ecclesiastical contexts reveals the spiritual framings that were applied. Prisoners were not simply confined, but in retreat. They were not merely isolated, but in contemplation. They were not suffering, but doing penance. The reframing was not accidental. By translating the language of imprisonment into the language of spiritual practice, the Church could acknowledge the harshness of confinement while simultaneously interpreting it as beneficial. This linguistic transformation allowed religious authorities to maintain a self-image of compassion even while overseeing brutal conditions. The integration of religion and punishment extended to the moment of execution as well. Public executions were often framed as spiritual events. A condemned person would be given the opportunity to confess, to receive last rites, to make peace with God before death. Their execution would be witnessed by clergy, sanctifying the death through religious presence. The condemned person's final moments were interpreted through religious language as a passage from earthly suffering to eternal judgment, as an opportunity to achieve salvation through martyrdom to church or crown authority, as a final act of obedience to divine will, as embodied in the authority imposing the sentence. The prisoner who went to their death, maintaining composure and religious faith, was celebrated as a spiritual hero. The prisoner who resisted or cursed was condemned not only to death, but to the theological judgment that they were rejecting God's will. What emerges from examining the religious dimensions of medieval imprisonment is that faith and oppression became virtually indistinguishable. Authority claimed to act in God's name. Suffering was presented as spiritually purifying. Resistance was framed as theological error. Obedience was equated with salvation. Through these framings, the Church lent its immense moral authority to the systems of confinement and punishment that served secular and ecclesiastical power alike. A prisoner could not simply resist their imprisonment as an injustice. They had to resist it as a theological system that defined their suffering as spiritually meaningful, their isolation as contemplative opportunity, their pain as redemptive pathway. They had to somehow maintain their sense of self against a total system in which every element, physical, psychological, theological, worked toward the same end: their spiritual and psychological transformation into obedient subjects of authority. Yet within this framework, questions emerge that the medieval authorities may not have fully considered. If pain could purify, could suffering be redemptive for the innocent? If God's will flowed through authority, who decided which people deserved redemptive suffering? Could an unjustly imprisoned person transform their innocent suffering into spiritual grace? Or did the theological justification only apply to suffering that authority deemed necessary? The Church never fully answered these questions, and the inconsistencies in their theology created spaces where resistance and doubt could persist, even within the framework of faith itself. Kings and queens understood something fundamental about the relationship between authority and legitimacy. Raw power, unadorned and exposed, generates resistance. People will rebel against power that is merely force. But power clothed in the language of the sacred, power that claims to represent divine will, power that presents itself as an extension of cosmic order rather than arbitrary human domination, that power becomes difficult to resist. The Church possessed an immense reservoir of sacred authority. If a monarch could align themselves with the Church, could secure the blessing of bishops and the endorsement of theological doctrine, they could transform their power from something merely political into something cosmic and eternal. The dungeon became one of the primary tools through which this transformation occurred. A king might commission a dungeon and then have a bishop bless the cells. The act of blessing was not merely symbolic. It signified that the dungeon was part of a sacred order. A prisoner held in a blessed cell was not merely suffering. They were experiencing the consequences of divine will, as enacted through human authority. When a bishop blessed the dungeon, he was in effect saying, "Whatever suffering occurs here occurs with God's approval. Whatever justice is enacted here is enacted in God's name." This was an extraordinary gift to offer a monarch. It provided theological cover for actions that might otherwise be questioned as cruel or unjust. A bishop who blessed a dungeon was endorsing whatever would be done within its walls. The relationship between monarchs and bishops was, in practice, far more negotiated and contingent than either party would have admitted. A monarch could not command a bishop to bless a dungeon if the bishop was powerful and independent. But a monarch could offer incentives. Land could be granted to the Church. Tax exemptions could be provided. Reliquaries could be gifted. A bishop whose cathedral needed rebuilding might be persuaded to offer blessing in exchange for the royal funds that would make the project possible. The letters that survive between monarchs and bishops sometimes explicitly discuss these arrangements, though always in language sufficiently veiled to maintain the fiction that authority emerged from pure theological principle rather than material negotiation. A bishop might write to suggest that the king's justice would be strengthened if particular prisoners were granted clemency. The king would respond that while he appreciated the bishop's counsel, certain prisoners remained threats to the realm. But perhaps the bishop might respond, if the king would release certain prisoners, the Church would be pleased to sponsor a festival celebrating the king's piety. The king, needing to appear pious to his subjects, might then announce that out of spiritual conviction he was granting certain prisoners mercy. These negotiations reveal something important. The church was not unaware that the dungeons were places of suffering. The bishops knew. They understood that blessing a dungeon meant endorsing the suffering that would occur there. Yet they did so anyway, and they did so knowing they would receive material and political benefits in return. The relationship between church and crown was not a case of the church being manipulated by secular power. It was a case of two powerful institutions discovering that they could profit from cooperation. The dungeon expanded the reach of both. A monarch could use the dungeon to control the kingdom. A bishop could use the dungeon and the blessing that sanctified it to expand the church's power and resources. Both benefited from a system in which authority was distributed between them, with suffering populations providing the foundation upon which both structures rested. The architectural symbolism of castles containing dungeons becomes particularly significant in this light. A castle tower rose toward heaven, pointed, reaching upward. At its base, beneath the ground, existed the dungeon reaching downward into darkness. Together, they expressed a complete theology. Above was light and divine presence. Below was darkness and separation from God. The prisoner in the dungeon was not merely confined. They were positioned in spiritual as well as physical opposition to the ruler above. The ruler, in the upper chambers, lived in relative light. The prisoner, in the depths, lived in darkness. The difference in light was not accidental. It was the spatial expression of spiritual hierarchy. Heaven above, hell below, and authority mediating between them. The rituals and ceremonies of monarchy took on increasingly sacred dimensions in this period. A king's coronation was a religious ceremony in which a bishop anointed the ruler with oil, conferring upon them a sacred status. The king was no longer merely a political leader. They were God's anointed, ruling by divine right. Once a king had been anointed, their authority derived directly from God. To resist the king was to resist God. To flee royal justice was to flee divine justice, and to suffer in a royal dungeon was to experience divine judgment made visible. A prisoner could not simply curse a king as an oppressor. The prisoner was cursing God's chosen instrument. The theological logic was complete and nearly airtight. Authority became unquestionable because it was sacred. What is striking about examining this period is how carefully the visual and material vocabulary of power was constructed. Cathedrals displayed enormous resources devoted to beauty and transcendence, soaring arches, intricate stonework, light filtered through stained glass, creating visions of the divine. Castles displayed enormous resources devoted to fortification and control, thick walls, narrow windows designed for defense, architecture that communicated impregnability and dominion over surrounding lands. The dungeon was rarely on display. It existed below, hidden, unseeable. Yet its existence was known. Everyone knew that dungeons existed beneath castles. Everyone understood what dungeons meant. The hidden dungeon became more psychologically powerful than a dungeon displayed openly would have been. What could not be seen could be imagined, and imagination generates more fear than direct perception. The use of religious imagery to sanctify spaces of suffering extended beyond dungeons. Torture chambers were sometimes decorated with crucifixes. Execution grounds were blessed. Priests attended torture sessions, not to prevent them, but to witness them, and to administer extreme unction to the tortured if they lost consciousness. The presence of religious authority at these events did not constrain the violence. Instead, it consecrated it. It transformed violence into something meaningful and purposeful. A torture session conducted with a priest present was a form of religious ritual. The screams of the tortured became a kind of perverse prayer. The suffering became an offering to God and to authority. What emerges from examining the relationship between church and crown is a picture of two powerful institutions discovering that their interests could be aligned. The crown needed the church's blessing to transform naked power into legitimate authority. The church needed the crown's resources and protection to maintain its position and expand its influence. The dungeon was the perfect instrument for this alliance. It served both institutions' purposes. It generated obedience through fear. It provided the church with opportunities to demonstrate spiritual authority through the blessing and sanctification of suffering. It provided the crown with a tool of control that operated at multiple levels: political, psychological, and theological. A person imprisoned in a dungeon was not only being separated from society, they were being separated from God, made to experience living hell as punishment and spiritual opportunity. The system was elegant precisely because it was total. No framework existed from which to critique it. Resistance was not merely political or moral, it was theological heresy. Yet the very totality of this system contained within it the seeds of its eventual contestation. When systems of oppression become too total, when they extend into every dimension of human experience, they eventually generate resistance at every level as well. People began to question whether God would truly endorse such suffering. Prisoners began to experience visions and spiritual insights that contradicted official theology. Monks began to record forbidden truths in hidden manuscripts. The system that had seemed so complete began to show cracks. And through those cracks, alternative understandings of justice, mercy, and divine will begin to emerge. Prisons required money. This simple fact, often overlooked in histories that focus on dramatic events or theological justifications, was nonetheless fundamental to how medieval dungeons actually functioned. A dungeon was not a space that could be constructed once and then simply maintained indefinitely with minimal resource allocation. It required constant expenditure. Walls needed repair. Locks required maintenance. Guards needed to be paid. Prisoners needed to be fed, at least minimally, or they would die too quickly to serve their function as testimony to authority's power. All of these expenses fell somewhere, ultimately on the lord who maintained the dungeon, though often the costs were distributed across various shoulders through complex arrangements of fees and obligations. The infrastructure of captivity created economic relationships that connected the dungeon to the wider medieval economy. A blacksmith would be commissioned to forge chains. This was not casual work. Chains designed to hold prisoners needed to be constructed to precise specifications. A chain too weak would be ineffective. A chain too elaborate would be wastefully expensive. The blacksmith who took such commissions became implicated in the system. They were not simply creating a functional object, they were creating an object specifically designed to immobilize human beings. Yet the blacksmith's invoice recorded it as standard metalworking. The transaction could be described in purely economic terms, and the political and moral dimensions could be set aside. The blacksmith was a professional. They took commissions. The purpose of the commissioned object was not their concern. Similar economic relationships extended throughout the system. A carpenter would need to construct cell doors. A mason would repair walls. A provisioner would deliver food, often the coarsest grains and the lowest quality provisions, but food nonetheless. A jailer would be employed to manage the prisoners. Each of these people received payment. Each of them, through that payment, became invested in the continuation of the dungeon system. Not invested in the philosophical sense, few of them likely thought deeply about what they were contributing to, but invested in the economic sense. Their livelihood depended on the dungeon functioning. If the dungeon was suddenly abolished, multiple people would lose income. The professional network that sustained imprisonment was thus economically motivated to ensure that dungeons continued to exist and continued to require their services. What emerges from examining medieval account books is the casual way that imprisonment costs were recorded. A castle's annual accounts might include line items such as iron for chains, 15 shillings, straw for prisoner cells, 4 pence, wages for dungeon keeper, 40 shillings yearly. These entries sit alongside other expenditures in the same neutral accounting language. There is no indication in the ledgers that these costs represent human suffering. The entries are simply financial facts: money spent, services rendered, obligations incurred. Yet each entry represents decisions about resource allocation that had profound human consequences. The amount spent on straw affected how uncomfortable a prisoner would be. The wages of the dungeon keeper determined how attentive the keeper would be to prisoners' conditions. The spending on iron affected the security of the cells, and thus the duration of confinement possible within them. In some cases, imprisonment was explicitly framed as a commercial transaction. A noble might be imprisoned as a hostage, with their family required to pay a regular ransom or fee to keep them alive and relatively comfortable. The imprisoned noble might be charged for their cell, for their food, sometimes even for their chains. A lord might maintain a prison specifically as a revenue-generating operation, imprisoning people and charging their families for the possibility of release or for improved conditions. This practice was widespread enough that it acquired a name in some regions. The custom of ransom or cell rent. A wealthy prisoner's imprisonment could become a significant source of income for the lord who held them. The longer the imprisonment, the more fees could be collected. The more uncomfortable the conditions, the greater the incentive for family members to pay for improvements. The dungeon became a machine for extracting wealth from those connected to prisoners. This economic dimension of imprisonment reveals something important. The dungeon served multiple purposes simultaneously. It was a tool of political control. It was an instrument of spiritual punishment. It was also a business. These purposes were not in conflict. A dungeon that was profitable was a dungeon that would be maintained and expanded. A dungeon that generated revenue was a dungeon that would be prioritized in a lord's budget allocation. A dungeon that operated as a commercial enterprise was a dungeon that would be administered with sufficient competence to ensure it continued to generate income. The profitability of the dungeon actually ensured that it would be efficiently operated, not for the benefit of prisoners, but in the sense that it would reliably continue to exist and function. The provisioning of prisoners reveals the cost-cutting measures that characterized medieval prison administration. Prisoners typically received the cheapest available food. In many cases, this was bread made from grain unsuitable for other uses, grain that was spoiled, that contained stones or debris, that was barely edible. The bread often had to be dampened with water to be consumed. This food cost almost nothing to produce and distribute, and it was sufficient to keep prisoners alive while being as unpleasant as possible. A prisoner consuming such rations day after day would gradually become malnourished, but the process would take weeks or months rather than resulting in quick death. The economics of prisoner provisioning thus determined the duration of their survival and the trajectory of their physical degradation. Some lords developed a systematic approach to prisoner economics. They maintained records of each prisoner: the prisoner's name, the date of imprisonment, the fees paid or owed, any ransom negotiations underway. These records were organized like inventory lists. A prisoner was an asset whose value derived from potential ransom or fees. Once that value had been extracted, or once it became clear that no further fees could be obtained, the prisoner's continued maintenance became a pure cost with no offsetting revenue. At that point, some lords would simply release the prisoner, not out of mercy, but out of economic logic. Why continue to feed and house someone who was generating no income? Other lords would simply leave the prisoner in the cell and discontinue the minimal expenditures that had kept them alive. The economic logic of the dungeon thus determined not only imprisonment duration but also the cause of death. The connection between imprisonment and economic interest creates a peculiar ethical problem. A system that operates as an economy generates its own perpetuation. People employed to manage dungeons have reason to ensure that dungeons continue to hold prisoners. Blacksmiths who forge chains have reason to see more chains ordered. Provisioners who deliver food to prisoners have reason to see more prisoners fed. A system organized around the captivity of human beings will, if profitable, reproduce itself. It will find ways to justify its continuation. It will generate ideology to explain why captivity is necessary. It will create legal frameworks to ensure a steady supply of captives. Over time, the economic interests become so embedded in the social structure that it becomes difficult to imagine society functioning without them. What is particularly striking about the medieval dungeon economy is how unremarkable it was. No one seemed to see anything unusual about the fact that imprisonment was profitable. A lord charging fees for holding a prisoner was simply being practical. A blacksmith being paid for chains was simply doing their job. A provisioner delivering food to dungeons was simply conducting business. The moral problem of profiting from human confinement did not register as a problem. It was simply commerce, occurring within the normal framework of economic exchange. This normalization of profiting from captivity allowed the system to expand and entrench itself. What might have seemed shocking, a system where wealth was extracted from the suffering of imprisoned people, became simply the ordinary operation of business. The dungeon was a normal business. Captivity was a normal commodity. Suffering was a normal service being exchanged for payment. and once suffering could be routinely bought and sold, it became nearly impossible to question its moral status. The records are sparse. Official chronicles rarely mention imprisoned women. The dungeon, in historical accounts, is overwhelmingly male prisoners, male judges, male guards, male architects. Yet women existed in these spaces. How many cannot be precisely determined because so few names survived. But the traces that remain suggest that women populated the darkness at rates that official histories obscure. They were wives of rebels imprisoned as leverage. They were widows accused of witchcraft. They were women who had spoken too freely or refused unwanted marriages. They were servants accused of theft by their employers. They were women whose only crime was being female, at a time when femininity itself was increasingly subject to suspicion and scrutiny. The trials and imprisonments of women followed patterns distinctly different from those of men. A man might be imprisoned for political opposition or criminal action. A woman was more often imprisoned for moral transgression or supernatural accusation. The categories of crime and punishment were gendered. A woman who possessed knowledge of herbs was potentially a witch. A woman who bore a child out of wedlock was morally culpable. A woman who possessed property and refused to cede it to a male relative was a transgressor. A woman who engaged in commerce or maintained independence was suspect. The dungeon thus served particular purposes for women not only as a tool of political control, but also as a mechanism of gender enforcement. To be imprisoned as a woman was to be imprisoned not simply for actions one had taken, but for the fundamental reality of one's gender and the expectations attached to it. Many women imprisoned on witchcraft charges would have experienced confinement prior to trial or execution. A woman accused of witchcraft would be interrogated, and the interrogation often took place in a confined space. She would be searched for witches' marks, any unusual skin feature that could be interpreted as evidence of demonic connection. She would be kept isolated to prevent her from bewitching others. Some women confessed to witchcraft under this interrogative pressure, not because they had actually engaged in supernatural practices, but because the psychological and physical pressure of confinement, combined with the certainty that they would eventually be condemned, made confession a form of surrender. A woman who confessed might face execution more quickly, which could be preferable to months of interrogation and confinement. The experiences of women in dungeons were often compounded by sexual vulnerability. While male prisoners faced violence and degradation, female prisoners faced the additional threat of sexual assault. A woman confined to a dungeon was at the mercy of guards and jailers who had absolute power over her. There are oblique references in some historical texts to women prisoners being subjected to sexual violence, though such references are usually couched in euphemistic language. Official records are almost silent on the matter, as if the sexual vulnerability of imprisoned women was too disturbing or too normal to document. Yet the silence itself is evidence. The absence of written record does not mean that such violence did not occur. It means that such violence was not deemed significant enough to record formally. Some of the most tangible evidence of female imprisonment comes not from official documents, but from physical artifacts. Archaeologists have uncovered remains in dungeon sites that appear to be female. Bones that show signs of physical malnutrition or disease consistent with long-term confinement. In some cases, simple objects have been found near these remains: a ring, a small piece of cloth, a scratched stone. These objects are remarkable in what they suggest about inner life. The ring might have been a marker of identity, evidence that the woman had belonged to someone, had possessed a name and a history. The cloth might have been a comfort object, something held when despair became overwhelming. The scratched stone might represent an attempt to mark time or assert presence. These objects are so small, so ordinary, yet in the context of imprisonment, they become profound expressions of human continuity and resistance. In some dungeons, women's cells have been found to contain marks and carvings distinct from those found in male cells. Where men's carvings often feature dates or counting systems or religious symbols, women's carvings sometimes include motifs that seem more personal: initials, sometimes repeated names, sometimes patterns that might represent spinning or weaving crafts that would have been central to many women's identities before imprisonment. These carvings suggest that women imprisoned in dungeons maintained interior lives that connected to their pre-imprisonment identities even as their physical existence was confined. They were not simply reduced to biological suffering. They were people attempting to preserve some sense of self through marking and naming. The cases of individual women prisoners that emerge from scattered records are often tragic, frequently absurd, always revelatory of how gender shaped confinement. A widow in Scotland accused of witchcraft after her husband's death. A woman in France imprisoned for refusing to marry a man her father had selected. A woman in Germany confined to a dungeon after her lender declared her incapable of repaying her debt, though she had not been given access to employment that might have allowed her to generate income sufficient for repayment. A serving woman imprisoned for allegedly poisoning her employer, though no autopsy was performed, and the employer lived for days after the alleged poisoning. The accusations that sent women to dungeons often seem flimsy in the context of modern sensibility, yet in their time they were sufficient. A woman's word carried less weight than a man's. A woman's behaviour was more subject to interpretation and suspicion. A woman's freedom existed only at the sufferance of male relatives or authorities. Yet amid the documentation of suffering are occasional glimpses of resilience. Some imprisoned women became oracles of sorts to other prisoners. A woman with knowledge of herbs, potentially why she had been accused of witchcraft in the first place, might heal other prisoners during confinement. A woman with literacy might teach other prisoners to read or write. A woman with spiritual conviction might offer spiritual solace. These women transformed their own imprisonment into a form of service to other confined people. They created interior communities within the dungeon spaces. They established hierarchies and relationships that provided structure and meaning amid dehumanization. Whether this represents genuine community or a form of psychological survival mechanism, the question may be unanswerable. But it represents the human capacity to maintain connection even when every external circumstance works toward isolation. What is perhaps most striking about women's imprisonment is how thoroughly it has been erased. Official histories discuss famous male prisoners, famous trials, famous dungeons. Female prisoners appear rarely, almost as afterthoughts. Yet they were there. They occupied cells. They carved into walls. They bore their confinement as men did, though often with the additional burden of gendered vulnerability. Their stories have largely disappeared from the historical record, which means that contemporary understanding of medieval imprisonment is fundamentally skewed toward male experience. We have inherited a history that is male by default. Despite the fact that women were present in dungeons in numbers we can only estimate from fragmentary evidence. The rings and cloth and scratched stones that archaeologists occasionally recover from dungeon excavations are perhaps all that will ever remain to testify to these women's presence. A ring might once have been worn on a woman's hand. A piece of cloth might once have provided comfort to a woman in despair. A scratched stone might represent the last assertion of a woman's existence before she disappeared into the dungeon's final darkness. These small objects are all that survives. They are all that is left to remember women whose names will never be known, whose crimes, if they possessed crimes at all, will never be clearly established, whose suffering will never be fully acknowledged. Yet the objects remain. The walls remember. And in that remembering, there exists at least the possibility of restoration, the possibility that these women, forgotten by official history, might yet be honoured by those willing to listen to what the stones have to say about the lives contained within them. Change came slowly, so gradually, that people living through the transition often did not recognise that change was occurring. It began not with great revolutionary pronouncements, but with quiet questioning. A philosopher in Renaissance Italy begins to write about the nature of suffering. He argues that excessive punishment degrades not only the prisoner, but also the society that permits such degradation. The argument is tentative, careful not to directly challenge authority, but it plants a seed. A scholar in Northern Europe reads the philosopher's work, and is moved to write his own meditations on justice and mercy. A bishop, reading both texts, begins to wonder whether the theological justifications for imprisonment might be incomplete, might be missing some essential Christian principle about the redemptive power of compassion. These are private thoughts, conversations in limited circles, yet they represent a shift in consciousness. They represent people beginning to question frameworks that had seemed unquestionable. By the 16th century, public discourse about punishment had begun to change. Humanist writers were articulating arguments about the proper limits of state power. They questioned whether the state had the right to cause unlimited suffering. They challenged the assumption that punishment served only deterrence, Or retribution, perhaps punishment could serve rehabilitation, they suggested. Perhaps a prisoner could be reformed, could be reintroduced to society as a functional member. These ideas seem modest now, almost self-evident. But in a world where dungeons had been considered natural and necessary for centuries, the suggestion that they might be questioned at all represented intellectual revolution. The ideas spread slowly through educated circles. They were debated in universities. They influenced the thinking of magistrates and judges. Not all judges, certainly. But enough that the uniform acceptance of dungeons began to fracture. Actual reforms, when they came, were often the result of specific incidents that captured public attention. A prisoner of noble birth was exposed to scandalous conditions, and family members, possessing both power and literacy, documented the abuse. A traveller observed a dungeon in one region and wrote an account that shocked readers in another. An escaped prisoner published an account of their confinement that circulated widely despite attempts at suppression. These incidents created openings for reform arguments. Authorities faced with public knowledge of dungeon horrors sometimes responded by implementing improvements. Better food would be provided. Cells would be cleaned more regularly. Guards would be selected for some minimal level of training. These reforms were often minimal. They changed the surface of the system without changing its fundamental nature. But they represented acknowledgement that the system could be criticized, that suffering was not infinitely acceptable, that some constraints on punishment might be legitimate. The movement against torture gained particular momentum in the 17th and 18th centuries. Philosophers and legal theorists began to argue that torture was not merely cruel, but ineffective. A person being tortured would confess to anything, they argued, regardless of guilt. Torture thus did not produce truth, but rather produced convenient confessions. Therefore, torture was both immoral and counterproductive. Rulers who had used torture to extract confessions began to question whether they were foolish to continue. Some regions began to formally abolish torture through legal pronouncements. These abolitions were not universal. Some rulers refused the argument. Some regions continued using torture long after other regions had formally renounced it. But the trajectory was toward elimination. The acceptability of torture, which had seemed unquestionable for centuries, became increasingly questioned, and eventually, in many places, formally rejected. Yet what is crucial to understand about these reforms is that they did not eliminate the dungeons. They did not release all imprisoned people. They did not dissolve the fundamental system of confinement and control. What they did was modify the system's operation. Dungeons became officially reformed even as they continued to exist. The cells were cleaner officially. The guards were trained officially. Torture was eliminated officially, though in practice some establishments continued using violence while simply not calling it torture. The system adapted. It learned to perform compliance with new standards while preserving its essential functions. In some cases, dungeons that had become famous for their horror were formally closed, and new prisons were built according to more modern principles. The new prisons were cleaner, better designed, more rationalized in their organization. They were, by the standards of the time, more humane. Yet they were still prisons. They still confined people. They still operated as tools of state power. The reform was real in its particulars but illusory in its scope. What is most striking about the reform movement is how it preserved the fundamental apparatus of control even while claiming to transcend it. A medieval dungeon operated through darkness and decay and terror. An 18th century reformed prison operated through systematic architecture, predictable routines, and rationalized discipline. The medieval dungeon broke the body through cold and damp and chains. The reformed prison broke the spirit through isolation and routine, and the permanent presence of authority. The change was real. 18th century prisoners were, in many cases, treated materially better than medieval prisoners. But the fundamental extraction of agency, the fundamental reduction of the human being to a controlled object, remained. The reform had made the system more sustainable, precisely by making it more palatable. Some dungeons were simply repurposed rather than abandoned. A medieval fortress might have contained a traditional dungeon beneath its foundations. As concepts of punishment changed, this dungeon might be closed, and a new building might be constructed to house prisoners according to modern principles. Yet the old dungeon remained, sealed or boarded up, existing beneath the new structure as a kind of shadow reminder of older methods. In some cases, these sealed dungeons were eventually excavated by archaeologists. In other cases, they were simply forgotten, their existence lost to living memory, even as the stone remained in place. A modern city might have been built over medieval dungeons, the traces remaining underground, inaccessible, yet somehow present in the geology, beneath contemporary buildings. The psychological effect of reform was significant. Once authorities had formally denounced torture and claimed to have reformed prisons, people could feel that progress had occurred. The problem had been recognized and was being fixed. Those who continued to advocate for further reform, or who protested the conditions of prisons, could be told that they were living in a reformed era, that things had already improved, that impatience was unreasonable. The reforms, by making the worst abuses officially unacceptable, simultaneously made ongoing abuses harder to challenge. If torture was officially illegal, then evidence of torture could be dismissed as aberration, individual corruption, rather than systematic practice. If prisons were officially reformed, then continued suffering within prisons could be attributed to prisoners' own failings rather than to the system itself. What emerges from examining the reform movement is a complex historical picture in which progress is real but incomplete, in which change is genuine but often preserves the fundamental structures it claims to transcend. The dungeons of the medieval era gave way to the prisons of the modern era. The transition represented real improvements in material conditions. It represented genuine shifts in thinking about punishment and justice. It represented the influence of humanist philosophy on practical governance, yet it also represented the evolution of systems of control into forms that were simultaneously more sophisticated and more difficult to challenge. The medieval dungeon was brutal and visible. Its horrors were difficult to deny. The modern prison was more subtle. Its suffering was dispersed through systems of routine and architecture, rather than concentrated in explicit torture. It was easier to defend, easier to justify, easier to accept as necessary. As the old dungeons were sealed and replaced with new prisons, something was lost from collective memory. The direct experience of what confinement at its worst looked like was no longer available. People could now imagine that imprisonment was fundamentally different from what it had been in the dark past. The modern prison, they could tell themselves, was nothing like the medieval dungeon. And technically this was true. The modern prison was operating according to different principles. Yet the fundamental relationship remained: authority confining human beings, removing their freedom, controlling their existence through systems of punishment and coercion. The dungeon did not disappear. It was preserved in the stones of old castles, sealed beneath modern buildings, kept alive in folklore and literature. And the system it represented, the system of confining human beings as a tool of power, did not disappear either. It simply evolved, adapted, learned to present itself in new forms. Once the dungeons ceased to function as active instruments of confinement, they entered a different phase of existence. They became monuments. They became stories. They became the subject of artistic interpretation and romantic imagination. The transformation was gradual, beginning perhaps in the late 18th century and accelerating through the 19th. As industrial civilization expanded, as cities modernized and old medieval fortresses became surrounded by urban development, these structures acquired a new status. They were no longer part of the functional apparatus of power. They were relics, historical curiosities, reminders of a past that contemporary society felt itself to have transcended. Romantic-era writers discovered the medieval dungeon as a subject of artistic fascination. Poets and novelists began to write about dungeons with a particular aesthetic sensibility. The dungeon became a space of sublime horror, terrible, yes, but also beautiful in its terribleness. A dungeon described in romantic poetry was a place of shadowed grandeur, of noble suffering, of aristocratic tragedy. The actual experience of a medieval prisoner, the filth, the disease, the psychological degradation, was often stripped away in favor of a narrative in which a beautiful or virtuous person suffered nobly in darkness. The dungeon became a setting for stories about love, betrayal, heroism. A maiden imprisoned unjustly in a tower, a knight held prisoner by a tyrant, a scholar imprisoned for his learning. These narratives transformed the dungeon from a place of random suffering into a place that made narrative sense, that was structured by morality and meaning. Visual artists followed. painters began to depict dungeons not as they had actually existed, but as romantic imagination constructed them. The paintings showed dramatic chiaroscuro, with light from narrow windows creating pools of illumination in vast darkness. The dungeons in these paintings were often larger and more architecturally elaborate than actual medieval dungeons had been. They were magnificent in their scale and decay. A prisoner in such a dungeon was not simply suffering, they were suffering in the presence of terrible beauty. The paintings created an aesthetic of imprisonment that was far removed from the actual experience of confinement. Yet these paintings, reproduced in books and displayed in galleries, shaped how subsequent generations understood dungeons. People would visit actual medieval fortress ruins and attempt to see them through the lens of romantic artistic interpretation, superimposing the painter's visions onto the fragmentary remains. Travelers and tourists began visiting these fortress ruins in the 19th century, seeking encounters with picturesque history. A castle with a famous dungeon might become a destination. Tourists would descend into the darkness, guided by local guides who would recount stories, some historically grounded, many entirely invented. The guide might point to a corner of the dungeon and claim that this was where a particular famous prisoner had been held, or point to a wall marking and claim it was a prisoner's carving, even if it was clearly of more recent origin. The truth became less important than the creation of an atmosphere, an experience. The tourist came to feel history, not to learn it precisely. The dungeon became a kind of theatre in which tourists played the role of witnesses to history. Literature increasingly transformed the dungeon into a metaphor. A dungeon was not simply a historical structure, but a representation of oppression, of the weight of history, of the persistence of the past. In novels, characters would be imprisoned in dungeons that represented their psychological states. A dungeon could symbolize guilt or despair, or the constraining weight of social expectation. The actual medieval dungeon retreated further from consciousness. What remained was the idea of the dungeon, an imaginative construction shaped by romantic sensibility and symbolic necessity rather than historical accuracy. Some dungeons, particularly those attached to famous castles or located in convenient locations, became formally organized tourist attractions. Tickets could be purchased, hours of operation were posted. The dungeons were partially restored, made safe for visitors. Information plaques might be installed, though the information was often more legend than fact. Some dungeon tours became theatrical experiences, with actors portraying guards or prisoners, with sound effects simulating screams from cells, with a whole experience designed to entertain and frighten in measured doses. The dungeon, which had once been a place of genuine terror, became a managed fear experience. The terror was now controlled, containable, part of an entertainment package. The effect of this transformation was complex. On one hand, it kept awareness of dungeons alive in public consciousness. A person who would never read a scholarly history might visit a fortress and descend into a dungeon and acquire some sense that such places had existed, that imprisonment was part of the historical past. On the other hand, the romantic and entertainment-focused narratives obscured the actual historical experience. The randomness of imprisonment, the arbitrariness of judgment, the grinding suffering of confinement, these realities were often absent from the tourist experience. Instead, the tourist encountered a narrativized history in which suffering had meaning, in which imprisonment was connected to great events, or great crimes, or great loves. The actual experience of unknown prisoners suffering for unknown reasons in forgotten cells could not be easily accommodated within this narrative framework. What is particularly interesting is how folklore emerged from these transformed understandings. Stories developed about particular dungeons. A castle might be said to be haunted by the ghost of a prisoner who died unjustly. A particular cell might be associated with a famous person's confinement, though the historical record might not support the connection. These folklore traditions persisted and evolved. A story told about a dungeon in the 19th century might be elaborated in the 20th century, gaining details and dramatic power with each retelling. Eventually, a dungeon's folklore might become more widely known than its actual history. More people would know the ghost story than would know the actual names and dates of prisoners who had been held there. What is lost in this transformation is difficult to calculate precisely but profound in its implications. Once the dungeon becomes primarily a story or a tourist experience, the possibility of systematic study of what actually occurred becomes more difficult. The folklore becomes a barrier to historical understanding. A tourist who has heard a dramatic ghost story about a dungeon might resist historical correction with the argument that the story has its own truth, its own power, regardless of factual accuracy. The emotional and imaginative truth of the story might seem more real than the historical truth. Yet the folklore also preserved something. Even though the stories became distorted, the fact of imprisonment was kept in living memory. The dungeon did not entirely vanish from consciousness. Its architectural remains continued to speak to people, even if people's interpretations of those remains became increasingly imaginative and removed from historical reality. In the stones themselves, something remained that resisted complete narrative transformation. A person standing in an actual medieval dungeon cell, even if they had absorbed all the romantic literature and tourist narratives, would experience something that the stories had not fully captured. The actual space would communicate, through its physical presence, something about confinement that imagination could not fully substitute for. As the 20th century progressed, the dungeon became increasingly a subject of entertainment and spectacle, rather than serious historical study. Medieval torture exhibits were displayed in tourist attractions throughout Europe. Restaurants were themed as medieval dungeons. Popular entertainment depicted dungeons with varying degrees of historical accuracy. The dungeon had become thoroughly integrated into popular culture as a symbol of a barbarous past that contemporary civilization had transcended. Yet even as the dungeon was transformed into legend and spectacle, the physical structures themselves persisted. The stones remained. The carvings remained. The archaeological evidence accumulated as modern excavation techniques revealed more about how these spaces had actually functioned. Beneath the layers of folklore and romantic interpretation and entertainment, the historical reality quietly persisted, waiting for anyone willing to look past the stories and see what the dungeons actually were. What has happened, then, is a peculiar kind of forgetting that is simultaneously a preservation. The dungeon is remembered, but remembered as spectacle, as legend, as story. The actual history is preserved in fragments and in the physical evidence of the ruins themselves. But that actual history exists now, in an uneasy relationship with the imaginative constructions that have built up around it. Contemporary people approaching medieval dungeons approach them through layers of interpretation. They see with eyes educated by romantic poetry, by Victorian novels, by 20th century horror entertainment. The raw historical experience is accessible only to those willing to strip away these accumulated interpretations and attempt to see what remains beneath. In recent years, beneath the streets of major European cities, archaeologists have discovered dungeons that had been sealed for centuries. These discoveries occur not through deliberate excavation, but often through accident. A basement renovation in Prague reveals a series of cells carved directly into bedrock. A subway construction project in Vienna unearths a medieval dungeon system that had been completely forgotten by surface history. An underground parking structure development in London accidentally breaks into chambers that had been sealed since the 17th century. Each discovery is announced to local media with a mixture of excitement and reverence. The discoveries are treated as historical finds, as connections to the city's past. Yet often, the modern discoverers seem only partially aware that they are uncovering not just architectural remains, but sites of human suffering preserved in stone and preserved in time. When modern lights penetrate these spaces for the first time in centuries, what emerges is remarkably immediate. The carvings on walls, the scratches that mark days and prayers, the architectural details that controlled light and air, all of it becomes suddenly visible in ways that Romantic-era painters could not have captured. A contemporary archaeologist standing in a medieval dungeon cell sees, with perfect clarity, what a prisoner would have seen. The dimensions of the space, the quality of light, the acoustic properties of the stone. The space speaks to its visitor across centuries with a kind of urgency that cannot be mediated by artistic interpretation or folkloric elaboration. This is the actual space. This is where actual people stood, sat, suffered. Yet what is striking about these modern discoveries is how they are processed and presented. They are packaged as historical interest. They are contextualized within narratives of progress and transcendence. A museum might display artifacts from a discovered dungeon chains, locks, pottery with information placards explaining medieval punishment practices in the past tense. The dungeon becomes history. It becomes something that happened, that is now over. The modern visitor learns about medieval cruelty as one might learn about any historical phenomenon with intellectual interest and a comfortable sense that contemporary society has evolved beyond such practices. Yet the physical reality of the dungeon resists this comfortable narrative. A person standing in an actual medieval dungeon cell, even if they are visiting it as a historical tourist, often experiences something that the intellectual framing does not fully account for: the weight of the stone, the smell of moisture and age, the sense of absolute isolation that the space communicates, the spatial constraint that becomes almost physically felt. Even a person fully aware of the historical context, fully educated about medieval practices, often finds themselves experiencing something closer to the prisoner's actual experience than they had anticipated. The space itself is a teacher, communicating through physical presence rather than through historical narrative. What is particularly significant about contemporary dungeon discoveries is that they occur in the context of modern cities. A dungeon discovered beneath a contemporary European city is immediately placed in relationship to the present. The past is literally beneath the present. The modern city exists on top of the medieval city. Contemporary citizens walk above spaces that contain evidence of historical suffering. The knowledge that such spaces exist, that they remain beneath the streets, that they preserve voices and marks and traces of forgotten people, this knowledge creates a peculiar haunting of the present. Some of these discovered dungeons have been opened to the public as museum spaces. Visitors can descend into them, experience them, understand them not only intellectually but somatically. These spaces function as a kind of corrective to the romantic idealization of dungeons that developed during the 19th century. A person who has read romantic poetry about dungeons might be surprised by the actual reality. The darkness is more absolute than paintings had suggested. The space is smaller and more claustrophobic than illustrations had depicted. The physical reality asserts itself against the imaginative elaboration. Yet what is most striking about contemporary dungeon discoveries is not what they reveal about the past, but what they suggest about the present. In examining the techniques of medieval confinement, the architectural design, the sensory deprivation, the psychological manipulation, modern observers often recognize patterns that seem disturbingly familiar. The careful calculation of spatial dimensions to maximize psychological discomfort, the use of isolation as a tool, the deprivation of sensory stimulation to break resistance, the architectural normalization of confinement so that those within it accept their circumstances as inevitable. These techniques, identified in medieval dungeons, seem to echo in contemporary structures. Modern prisons, while vastly different in their surface characteristics, employ many of the same psychological mechanisms that medieval dungeons employed. The deprivation of sensory stimulation, the isolation achieved through architectural design, the routinization of degradation, the systems of control that operate not through continuous overt violence, but through the architecture itself. A contemporary prison cell is clean and well lit, utterly unlike a medieval dungeon. Yet the fundamental mechanism, the removal of autonomy, the constant presence of authority, the claustrophobic space designed to break resistance, remain similar. The medieval dungeon and the modern prison employ different vocabularies, but speak the same language of control. What is more disturbing is recognizing that the psychological techniques of medieval imprisonment have not simply persisted, but have been refined. Contemporary systems of confinement understand neuroscience, psychology, and architecture in ways that medieval builders did not. A modern secure facility is engineered with greater precision. Every element, lighting, sound, temperature, spatial configuration, is calculated to produce specific psychological effects. In some ways, contemporary confinement is more sophisticated precisely because it operates through systems rather than through explicit violence. A medieval prisoner might be tortured overtly. A modern prisoner is often broken through the careful application of routine, isolation, and environmental control. The suffering might be less visible, but it can be equally profound. When contemporary observers recognize these parallels between medieval and modern confinement, they often experience a kind of historical dissonance. We tell ourselves that we have transcended the medieval dungeon. We point to reforms, to legal protections, to modern sensibilities. Yet the underlying mechanism persists. Authority still removes people from society. Authority still uses confinement as a tool. Authority still designed spaces specifically to break resistance and enforce compliance. The dungeon has not disappeared. It has simply evolved. It has become more systematic, more rationalized, more thoroughly integrated into institutional practice. What makes the contemporary discovery of medieval dungeons particularly significant is that they allow us to see, with clarity, the persistence of certain mechanisms across centuries. The prisoner carving their name into a medieval dungeon wall and the contemporary prisoner writing a letter protesting their conditions are engaged in similar acts of resistance. The medieval architect designing a cell to maximize psychological discomfort and the contemporary engineer designing a modern, secure facility are engaged in similar technical problems. The framework has evolved, but the fundamental relationship between authority and confinement, between design and control, remains. In the ancient echoes of medieval dungeons, we hear something about the present that we might otherwise miss. We hear that the systems we have built are not as different from the systems of the past as we would like to believe. We hear that the shadows of the medieval dungeon still fall across contemporary practice, even if we no longer acknowledge or articulate what casts those shadows. This recognition does not necessarily lead to simple conclusions. The contemporary prison serves functions that medieval dungeons did not. Contemporary confinement operates within legal frameworks that at least theoretically constrain absolute power in ways that medieval frameworks did not. Contemporary societies maintain institutions of appeal and critique that did not exist in the medieval period. Yet none of this changes the fact that the fundamental mechanism of confinement persists, that authority still reaches down and removes people from freedom, that systems of control still employ many of the techniques that medieval architects and rulers discovered and refined. The dungeon died as an explicit form of punishment, but something very much like the dungeon survives in transformed and systematized shapes. In the silence of an unearthed dungeon, when the archaeologists have left and the modern world has receded, something becomes visible that cannot be articulated through facts or dates or historical narratives. It is a quality of the space itself, a presence that accumulates across centuries. To sit in such a space is to confront something fundamental about the nature of human civilization and the role that confinement plays within it. The dungeon is not an anomaly. It is not a deviation from normal human society. It is, in a strange way, normative. Every civilization builds dungeons. Every age develops methods of confinement. The specific forms change, but the underlying impulse remains. Civilizations, it seems, require spaces in which to place people they cannot control. Civilizations require mechanisms for containing resistance, for isolating dissent, for separating those deemed dangerous or inconvenient from the rest of society. The question that emerges from this observation is not why medieval society built dungeons. That question is easily answerable through reference to political necessity, to the need to maintain authority, to the mechanics of power. The more difficult question is why contemporary society continues to build prisons. Why, with all our intellectual advancement, our knowledge of psychology, our understanding of rehabilitation and human development, do we continue to construct spaces designed to remove autonomy and enforce compliance? The medieval dungeon could be explained as a product of medieval thinking, brutal, theological, relatively unsophisticated in its understanding of human psychology. But the contemporary prison cannot be explained away so easily. We know more. We understand more. Yet we continue to build confinement systems that employ many of the same fundamental mechanisms. The question demands reflection. What is it about human civilization that seems to require confinement? One answer lies in the nature of authority itself. Authority, by definition, requires the ability to enforce compliance. A ruler or system that cannot punish resistance is a ruler or system that cannot ultimately maintain control. Therefore, authority must always maintain the capacity to confine, to isolate, to remove from society those who refuse compliance. The dungeon is not an exception to civilization. It is the foundation upon which civilization rests. The dungeon is what makes authority possible. Without the capacity to confine, authority would collapse into constant negotiation, constant compromise. Authority requires, at some level, the unquestionable ability to remove resistance. The dungeon provides that capacity. The dungeon is the space where authority's power becomes absolute. Yet this explanation, while accurate, does not fully address the psychological dimensions of confinement. Why do people, when given authority, so readily turn to confinement as a mechanism of control? Why is the dungeon such a universal response to the problem of resistance? Part of the answer seems to lie in the fact that confinement is clean. It removes the problem from sight. A person imprisoned is a person no longer visible in society. Their resistance, their questions, their presence are all contained within a space where they cannot disturb the functioning of the broader community. Confinement is thus an act of denial. It allows society to continue functioning as if the confined person does not exist. It allows authority to maintain the fiction that all is well, that there are no fundamental problems, that resistance is simply the aberration of abnormal individuals, rather than a legitimate response to legitimate grievances. The dungeon is also, fundamentally, an act of terror. Yet the terror it generates is not directed primarily at those imprisoned. The terror is directed outward, toward the free population. The knowledge that dungeons exist, that they contain people, that they represent what authority can do to those who resist this knowledge, shapes the behavior of everyone outside the dungeon. The dungeon becomes a kind of negative space in society, a space whose emptiness is more important than its occupation. The threat of the dungeon shapes behavior more effectively than the dungeon itself ever does. Therefore, the most effective dungeon is one that is known to exist, but is rarely filled. An empty dungeon that generates fear is more useful to authority than a full dungeon that people grow accustomed to. This is why dungeons are often mysterious. The less known about what actually occurs within them, the more people's imaginations supply their own horrors. Imagination generates fear far more effectively than any documented reality could. What becomes apparent when examining confinement across centuries is that the fundamental technology of the dungeon is the technology of fear itself. The physical architecture matters, certainly. The chains and walls matter. But what matters most is the psychological state induced by confinement, the knowledge that autonomy has been removed, that the confined person exists at the mercy of those who hold power over them, that the outside world is utterly inaccessible. This state can be induced in various ways. The medieval dungeon induced it through darkness, isolation, and physical privation. The contemporary prison induces it through architecture, routine, and the constant presence of authority. The specific mechanisms differ, but the fundamental psychological condition is similar. In both cases, the confined person experiences the absolute removal of autonomy. To understand confinement is thus to understand something fundamental about the nature of freedom and control. Freedom, it appears, is not a default state. Freedom requires constant maintenance. Societies must actively work to preserve freedom, or freedom gradually erodes. And one of the most effective ways that freedom erodes is through the normalization of confinement. Once confinement is accepted as necessary and inevitable, once dungeons or prisons are seen as simply part of the machinery of civilization, resistance to them becomes increasingly difficult. The confined person's protest seems like the protest of someone unable to understand why they must be confined. The society's acceptance of confinement seems like pragmatic recognition of reality. The very language used to discuss confinement, criminal justice system, corrections, rehabilitation, obscures the fundamental reality of removed autonomy behind language that suggests benevolent purpose. Yet in the stones of medieval dungeons, something persists that resists this obscuring language. The carved names, the scratched prayers, the simple marks indicating days counted. These artifacts testify to the fundamental human impulse to assert meaning and identity in the face of systems designed to erase them. A prisoner marking days was asserting that time continued, that they continued, that their existence continued, even if the system denied their significance. This is an act of profound resistance. Not resistance against walls or chains, such resistance is physically futile, but resistance against the erasure of self. The prisoner was saying, I am still here. I am still real. I am still a person whose existence matters, regardless of what this system says about me. This impulse to assert existence and meaning in the face of systems designed to deny them appears throughout human history. It appears in religious faith maintained in persecution. It appears in artistic creation in the face of oppression. It appears in relationships maintained across barriers, designed to prevent connection. It appears in hope maintained despite circumstances that suggest hopelessness. The dungeon does not ultimately succeed in reducing a person to nothing. The system tries. Authority tries. The machinery of confinement is designed for exactly this purpose. But human beings persist. They mark walls. They remember names. They maintain identity and meaning despite the system's attempt to strip it away. What the medieval dungeon teaches, then, is something about the nature of human resistance and human persistence. It teaches that systems of control, however total they seem, however sophisticated they become, cannot completely erase human meaning-making. It teaches that authority requires confinement precisely because authority fears human resistance. It teaches that confinement is not a solution to the problem of resistance, but an acknowledgement that resistance exists and cannot be eliminated. It teaches that every civilization that builds dungeons is building a monument not to its own strength, but to its own anxiety. The dungeon stands as evidence of what authority fears. And what authority fears is the capacity of human beings to refuse compliance, to maintain meaning and identity in the face of systems designed to destroy them, to persist in existing even when existence is made as difficult as possible. As dawn arrives after the long night of history, as we emerge from the depths of these medieval spaces and return to the contemporary world, we carry with us this knowledge. We know that confinement is not aberration, but norm. We know that authority requires the capacity to confine. We know that every civilization continues to build dungeons in new forms. We know that human beings, faced with confinement, respond with marking and naming and meaning-making. And, perhaps most importantly, we know that the existence of dungeons, ancient or modern, physical or invisible, tells us something crucial about ourselves. It tells us that we fear resistance. It tells us that we fear the freedom of others. It tells us that we continue to build systems of control precisely because we cannot trust that others will choose compliance. The dungeon, in all its forms, is ultimately a confession. It is authority admitting that it cannot trust freedom. And as long as that confession remains necessary, as long as we continue to build these spaces, we remain imprisoned alongside those physically confined. We are imprisoned by the fear that generates the dungeons. We are imprisoned by the systems we have built to manage that fear. We are imprisoned, perhaps, by the dungeon itself. Return with us for a moment to where we began. Imagine again the sound of water dripping against stone. Imagine the wind moving through passages carved centuries ago. Imagine the torchlight flickering against walls that have witnessed more than any voice can articulate. But now, having journeyed through this history, we listen differently. We understand what the dripping water has seen. We comprehend what the wind carries through those passages. We recognize the torchlight not as romantic illumination, but as the only light that might have reached into such darkness, and therefore the most precious light imaginable to those who dwelt there. The stone itself has become, through this exploration, something more than inert material. Stone is often thought of as the most passive of substances, solid, unchanging, without life or consciousness. Yet a stone that has stood for centuries bearing the marks of human hands, bearing the scratches of fingernails desperate to leave some sign of existence, bearing the weight of suffering and endurance, such a stone has become something more than passive. The stone has become a repository of memory. It has become a witness that cannot speak but cannot forget. Every mark carved into the wall of a medieval dungeon is an act of preservation. The prisoner who scratched their name into stone was not only asserting their present existence, they were also asserting their future persistence. They were saying, even if I disappear, even if my body is removed and disposed of, even if my family forgets me, and my name is struck from all official records, this mark will remain. This stone will remember. In carving into stone, the prisoner was creating a memory that would outlast their body. They were using the permanence of stone to fight against the impermanence that the dungeon was designed to impose. The dungeon tried to reduce a person to nothing. The mark in the stone said, "No, I was real. I was here. I existed." For centuries, these marks remained, often unseen. They existed in sealed dungeons, in forgotten chambers, in spaces that had been covered over and built upon. Yet the marks persisted. They waited. They remained ready to testify should anyone ever pay attention. And now, when archaeologists discover them, when modern people see these scratches and carvings, they recognize immediately what they are. They recognize them as acts of communication reaching across centuries. The prisoner who carved their name 800 years ago and the contemporary person who discovers that name have become connected across time through the medium of stone. The stone, patiently bearing the mark, has enabled this connection. The stone has preserved not only the mark, but also the testimony that someone, somewhere, cared enough to record their existence. What is remarkable about this function of stone is its moral neutrality. Stone does not judge. Stone does not decide which memories are worth preserving and which should be forgotten. Stone preserves what is given to it. A mark made in desperation, a prayer carved in hope, a name scratched in defiance, the stone receives them all equally and preserves them all equally. The stone becomes a kind of absolute record, preserving not the official version of history which is selective, which chooses what to remember and what to forget, but rather the traces of what actually happened. A contemporary historian reading official chronicles might find no mention of a particular prisoner, but standing in the dungeon, the historian can see the prisoner's carving in the stone, and the stone provides testimony that the chronicles omitted. This raises a profound question about the nature of memory and justice. Official history is written by those with power to write. Those without power prisoners, the dispossessed, the forgotten, leave traces rather than records. They carve, they scratch, they mark. These traces are often fragmentary and difficult to interpret. Yet they possess a particular kind of authenticity that official records do not possess. A prisoner's carving in stone cannot be censored, cannot be revised, cannot be made to fit an official narrative. The stone preserves what was, independent of what authority wanted to be remembered. Throughout this journey through medieval dungeons, we have encountered the persistent attempt by authority to erase certain people, certain stories, certain acts. Some prisoners were executed and buried in unmarked graves. Some died in confinement, and their bodies were disposed of. Some were simply forgotten, their names never recorded, their fates unknown. Authority attempted to ensure that these people would be as if they had never existed. Yet the stones resisted this erasure. The carvings remained. The scratches persisted. The marks that prisoners had made simply to assert their existence became, unexpectedly, monuments. The dungeons that were designed to be forgotten became preserved sites. The system designed to erase humanity became instead a repository of testimony to human endurance. The contemporary person who stands in a medieval dungeon, who sees these carvings, who recognizes them as the marks of real people whose names we do not know, but whose presence we can acknowledge, participates in an act of remembering that defeats the original purpose of the dungeon. The dungeon was designed to make people disappear. Yet centuries later, people are standing in that space and remembering that someone was there. They are honoring the existence of people who authority attempted to erase. They are allowing the stone to speak, through their own witnessing, what the stone has been preserving all along. This function of stone, this capacity for memory preservation, extends beyond the specific dungeons we have examined. Every historical site contains such testimony. Every ruin preserves traces of lives lived. Every stone that has existed for centuries has absorbed something of the people who lived near it, who touched it, who made marks upon it. To walk through a historical space with awareness is to walk through a landscape saturated with memory. Every step is a step through countless lives. Every mark on a wall is a connection to someone whose presence has otherwise disappeared. Yet memory, even the memory preserved in stone, depends ultimately on people willing to engage with it. A carving in stone is only testimony if someone sees it and recognizes it as testimony. A mark is only memory if someone witnesses it and allows it to carry meaning. The stone preserves, but the stone cannot force recognition. In each contemporary moment, people choose whether to see the marks or not, whether to recognize them as testimony or dismiss them as meaningless scratches, whether to let the dead speak or allow them to remain silent. This is where responsibility enters. The stone has done its work. The stone has preserved what was made upon it. Now, the living must decide what to do with this preservation. In the dripping of water, we hear now, not merely acoustic effect, but the voice of time itself, carrying forward the testimony that stone preserves. In the wind through ancient passages, we hear not merely physical phenomenon, but the breath of countless lives, the accumulated presence of all who suffered in such spaces. In the torchlight we see not romantic illumination, but the stubborn human refusal to accept absolute darkness, the persistent assertion that even in the most difficult circumstances, light is possible. The dungeon that was designed to be forgotten has become, through the persistence of stone and through the willingness of contemporary people to witness, a place of profound remembering. This is perhaps the deepest truth that dungeons teach, that memory is stronger than authority, that what is carved in stone cannot ultimately be erased, that the voices of the forgotten persist even when the system designed them to disappear. The medieval dungeon attempted to exercise ultimate control over human beings, yet it could not control stone. It could not prevent memory. It could not silence the testimony that would emerge centuries later when archaeologists descended into sealed chambers and saw the marks that prisoners had made. Authority had built a structure intended to be a monument to its own power. Instead, it had inadvertently preserved testimony against itself. The dungeon became evidence of what authority had attempted to hide. The stone became a voice for those whom authority had silenced. We stand now at the entrance to the dungeon. Behind us lies the darkness we have explored, centuries of suffering, systems of control, the weight of history pressing down through stone and time. And ahead of us, above the gate, there is light. Ordinary daylight, unspectacular and constant, the light that exists regardless of what happens in the darkness below. This light has been shining for all the centuries we have been descending into shadow. It has been shining above the gate while prisoners carved their names into walls. It has been shining while jailers maintained their routines. It has been shining while authorities built systems of power and control. It continues to shine now, indifferent to whether we choose to see it or to remain fascinated by the darkness. The journey through history that we have undertaken together has been a descent into darkness. We have encountered suffering, cruelty, injustice, and the persistent machinery of human oppression. We have seen how systems of control become normalized, how cruelty can be justified through theology and law and commerce, how the forgotten people beneath authority's notice can be erased from history. We have seen the worst of what human civilization has produced. Yet the journey has also revealed something else, something that exists alongside the darkness, but is not diminished by it. We have seen human resilience. We have seen people marking their existence into stone when everything else had been taken from them. We have seen jailers who maintained minimal dignity for prisoners despite their role in oppression. We have seen monks recording forbidden truths despite the danger. We have seen women maintaining identity and meaning against systems designed to erase them. We have seen the persistent human refusal to be completely reduced to nothing. The dungeon teaches something crucial about the nature of human civilization, that cruelty and compassion are not opposite poles, but can coexist within the same system, the same person, the same moment. Authority can be cruel, and yet authority contains those capable of mercy. Systems of oppression can be total, and yet human beings within those systems can find ways to resist or mitigate suffering. Prisoners can be completely confined, and yet maintain inner freedom. The dungeon is not a simple story of evil authority and innocent victims. It is more complex than that. It is a story of how human beings navigate impossible circumstances, how systems become normalized, how people adapt and survive, and sometimes persist with meaning and dignity even in spaces designed to strip both away. What the exploration of medieval dungeons reveals, when we allow ourselves to see it fully, is that we are looking at ourselves, not in the sense that contemporary society is exactly like medieval society that would be false, but in the sense that we share fundamental human characteristics with medieval people. We too have the capacity for cruelty when we feel threatened. We too can justify oppression through language and belief systems. We too build systems that we claim are necessary, even when those systems cause suffering. We too can become comfortable within systems of control, even when we intellectually oppose them. The medieval dungeon is not something that belongs entirely to the past. It belongs partly to the present. It belongs partly to us. Yet recognition of this continuity need not lead to despair. The fact that systems of control persist does not mean that resistance is futile. The fact that contemporary society has not completely transcended the mechanisms of the medieval dungeon does not mean that the reforms that have occurred are meaningless. The fact that oppression continues does not negate the progress that has been made. History is not a simple story of inevitable progress, but neither is it a story of endless repetition. Change happens. Reform happens. Consciousness evolves. What seemed natural and unquestionable in one era comes to be questioned in the next. What was accepted, practice becomes understood as cruelty. What was thought to be inevitable becomes recognized as alterable. The stones of the medieval dungeon preserve not only testimony to suffering, but also testimony to this possibility of change. The carving in the stone is evidence that someone existed and resisted erasure, but the fact that contemporary people stand in these spaces and recognize the carvings as testimony is evidence that consciousness has changed. The dungeon that was accepted as natural in the medieval era is now recognized as tragic. The system that was justified through theology is now understood as unjust. The prisoners who were forgotten have been partially restored to memory. This is not complete justice. The dead cannot be raised. The suffering cannot be undone. The years lost cannot be restored. But it is something. It is recognition. It is remembering. It is the acknowledgement that these people mattered, that their suffering was real, that their attempts to assert meaning were valid. What becomes possible when we truly see the dungeon not as romantic spectacle or historical curiosity, but as a real place where real suffering occurred, is a transformation in how we understand ourselves. We become aware of our own capacity for both cruelty and compassion. We become aware that the systems we accept as necessary may contain elements of injustice that future generations will recognize as such. We become aware that silence in the face of suffering is itself a choice. We become aware that memory is an act of resistance against erasure. We become aware that the present moment offers opportunities for compassion that the medieval era, constrained by different consciousness, may not have fully possessed. The light above the gate represents this possibility. It represents the light of awareness, the light of consciousness, that allows us to see both the darkness that exists and the possibility of moving toward something less dark. It represents the light that has shined for centuries, waiting to be noticed, waiting to illuminate the spaces where suffering occurs. This light does not erase the dungeon. The dungeon remains. The history remains. The suffering remains. But the light makes it visible. The light allows us to see what existed in darkness, and in seeing, we gain the possibility of choosing something different. As we prepare to leave the dungeon, to ascend toward that light above the gate, we carry with us the knowledge of what exists below. We carry with us the memory of those whose names we do not know, but whose marks we have seen. We carry with us the understanding that systems of control persist and evolve. We carry with us the awareness that compassion and cruelty both exist, often within the same person and system. We carry with us the knowledge that resistance is possible, that meaning can be made even in the most constrained circumstances, that the human capacity to endure and to hope persists despite all evidence that such persistence is futile. The dungeon gate opens onto a path. That path leads back to the world above, to contemporary civilization, to the systems and structures we inhabit and perpetuate. The question that remains, the question that each person must answer individually, is what we do with what we have learned. Do we simply return to ordinary life, carrying the knowledge but letting it fade into the background? Or do we allow the knowledge to change us, to make us more conscious of the systems we participate in, more attentive to suffering we might otherwise ignore, more committed to the possibility of compassion within structures that often promote indifference? The stones below cannot answer this question. They can only preserve the traces of what occurred, offering testimony to those willing to see. The light above the gate illuminates both darkness and possibility. We stand between them briefly before returning to the world above. Close your eyes for a moment and listen to the water dripping in the darkness below, and the wind moving through stone, and the sound of your own breathing as you stand at the threshold. Somewhere in that darkness, a voice centuries old is still scratching a name into stone, still refusing to disappear completely, still asserting existence despite systems designed to deny it. And somewhere in that light above, new consciousness emerges, new awareness develops, new possibilities become visible. Between the darkness and the light, we live. And in that space between, we have the choice to remember, to witness, and to transform what we have learned into something that matters.